Welcome to Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 4.
I don't know, I guess I just had the ambition to talk to people this year, bring back the interview format. I also still try to do several deep dives and cover some topics that I've really been wanting to get to and never had a chance to. And I guess just hope that everybody's willing to come along for the ride. Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome to Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Joswa, and tonight we are wrapping up our extensive deep dive series on Epstein with part 4-2 of Case Closed. Again, same content warning as the rest of this series, which you've hopefully heard by now. A very appropriate storm is brewing just outside my office. You might hear that too, or my completely freaked out dog, one or the other. This first part is picking up right where we left off with the rabbit hole chapter from part 4-1, and a little heads up, actually some of my opinions on what I'm about to cover right here on the top have kind of changed and shifted a little bit as I've continued to research and build this episode, but this is going to be a wild one. So maybe get comfy, pour a strong beverage, and go ahead and settle in as we jump back into our series finale of File002, Epstein, The Reckoning, 4-2, Case Closed. The next rabbit hole that we need to journey down in order to find any real semblance of truth is quite apt for this reference, because this is what lies beneath Little St. James and Zorro Ranch. The word tunnel is mentioned at least 181 times within the unsealed FBI and court records. Let's start with Epstein's Island, shall we? We've discussed the enigmatic temple structure with its golden dome and walls painted in the colors of the Israeli flag. Contained inside the small structure is what appears to be a routine library of sorts, with shelves, scaffolding, columns, and also stacked mattresses. The first real clue that the notorious temple may hold some darker secrets inside would be its dome ceiling, which is a large mural featuring the Zodiac. Pretty mundane, all in all on the surface. It was actually officially permitted as being a quote-unquote music pavilion, an 8-sided octagonal music pavilion. However, unsealed engineering schematics as well as recent drone and on-site media and content creator inspection paint a very different picture of what it came out to be. The structure also features a prominent staircase leading down into a subterranean ventilated concrete basement level, and the existence of tunnels that are even mentioned in email exchanges with one associate asking about construction delays and joking, quote, "What's up with the Caribbean island? Staff still sleeping in the tunnels?" Their existence would be further confirmed by physical inspections by contractors and law enforcement who described a network of underground quote-unquote utility tunnels connecting the main villa to auxiliary buildings and even a lower garage area. Epstein's legal team would claim that they were strictly for industrial infrastructure, but victims' advocates have rightfully noted that they effectively allowed the movement of people across the island without being in view of outside visitors or even the standard service staff. Bear in mind, this island, as prosecutors have alleged, was the epicenter of an international web of child sex trafficking, where girls as young as 14 have claimed that they were trafficked to, confined to, and repeatedly assaulted at, and not just by Epstein. Much like Zorro Ranch with its extreme isolation, once victims were brought here, any real escape becomes too difficult or too dangerous to even attempt. A fact that was very much intentional in their planning, I feel at least, along with being far from the prying eyes of the public for Epstein and his friends and far away from help for their victims. There are other mentions of tunnels scattered all across his emails, aside from the one asking if staff were still sleeping in the tunnels, which was from Peggy Siegel, by the way, if you know you know. Most of the emails concerning the tunnels are between Epstein and staff, where he is inquiring about the progress of work being done on them. The first mention of them that I could find was a 2009 email to Gary Kearney to, quote, leave Doug out, after Kearney had emailed Doug Schodel discussing design plans like removing the admin office, removing the tunnel, and keeping the basement spaces within the main floor footprint. Doug Schodel is an architect/design professional who Epstein had worked with previously on his Palm Beach property, and was also part of the contractor group that helped design and carry out the build and renovations on the island. Gary Kearney was the CEO of New Albany Company, which Wexner and Epstein co-incorporated in '98, with Epstein serving as the president of the company. Without getting too bogged down in the details, 1 year after the mob-style hit took Arthur Shapiro out of the picture, in 1986, Epstein took over. Wexner and Jack Kessler would form a consortium that would eventually become the New Albany Company by buying up 5,000 acres in the New Albany area of Ohio, effectively securing the entire town for their developments. He would later acquire another 5K over time. His plan was simple: buy up cheap rural land, build a high-end brand, then extract massive value as the property values explode. Through the 90s, the New Albany Company, or NACO, would transform the rural village into an upscale enclave. In '98, that NACO development would either be reincorporated or just dissolved to make way for the other successor entity under the same name, which would be co-incorporated by Wexner and Epstein as serving as the president. Wexner claims he cut ties with Epstein following his '06 arrest in Florida, and from '07 onward his name would vanish from the company's website. I'm calling bullshit on Wexner though, because, quote, cutting ties doesn't just mean that Epstein's ownership in New Albany just disappears. Basic partnership law maintains that Wexner would at very least have had to buy Epstein out. Now, I know we're getting kind of deep down the ADHD side tangent here from the tunnel conversation, but just bear with me for a sec, because there's no public record that Wexner ever bought Epstein out, no documented settlements at all, and no disclosure of how Epstein's equity was ever handled. Instead, NACO just removed Epstein's name, and their official stance is that he, quote, was never employed by the company, which directly contradicts Ohio business records from 1998, listing Epstein as co-president and incorporator. Stick with me here. Kearney, who was again the CEO of New Albany Company, kept working for Epstein long after the '06-07 period where Wexner and NACO claims to have severed ties. Kearney managed Epstein's properties from '99 till about 2012. He also oversaw the $1 million upgrade of Epstein's Island in '09 to 2010, by which point Kearney was Epstein's second highest paid employee, raking in a fat annual salary of $368,413. So the relationship, at very least, certainly went on well beyond Epstein's first arrest. I'm getting back to the tunnels, I swear, but here's where this rabbit hole led me real quick. While trying to trace any sort of buyout transaction, I found that back in '92, Epstein bought a home from Wexner and Kessler's company, JW and CPK & Co., which was another real estate development company. He would pay $3.5 million for it, which was well above market value. The mansion, sitting on a little over 30 acres, was located inside the Wexner estate compound at 5025 East Dublin Granville Road in New Albany. He would turn around 6 years later in '98 when he and Wexner co-incorporated the New Albany Company and sell the house for a staggering 129% gain of $8 million, highest in the Franklin County area at that time that had ever been recorded for a private residence, to an LLC called HHD&B. With a little digging, I found that HHD&B LLC just so happens to have the exact same address of 8000 Walton Parkway as the New Albany Company does, which is a multi-office hub that was the administration office, the HQ for the company, I guess. Without dragging you guys through the whole sordid affair that I had to uncover and dig through, this basically means that the sale was internal, obviously. But here's how this works. That ultra-high sales price becomes part of the public record and part of the comparable sales data. So when appraisers value the surrounding homes that New Albany was building and selling, they use the comparable sales or comps, and that $8 million sale creates a high anchor that raises all nearby home and land values. Even though it was technically just an internal transaction, that elevated price becomes the truth in the public record. And wouldn't you know it, New Albany home values skyrocketed immediately after this, and from '98 until now, year over year, New Albany has outpaced the national average considerably and is still one of the most expensive housing markets in America. The worst part, that's all totally legal, and it's one of the same shell games that private equity has played all over the country that has artificially inflated housing costs and pushed them out of the reach of the majority of Americans for the first time in history. So why am I telling you this now? Because these people are deeply corrupt on top of being morally bankrupt, and none of this ended with Epstein. Not the child trafficking, not the financial manipulation, not the control of the Epstein class, none of it. There's much more work to do, and as they say, we are truly not mad enough. More on that later, though. For now, back to the island and back to these tunnels. Aside from the New Albany sale, also happening in 1998, Epstein purchased Little St. James and began major renovations by the early 2000s. These renovations would wrap up sometime shortly after March of 2003. Permit records show that after his travel restrictions following his release ended, he began expanding again on the island, with permits reflecting him building the pool, spa, cabana, and underground theater. If you recall, the official story is that all of the underground tunnels were supposedly just for maintenance, equipment, and running quote-unquote high-voltage wires, and that there weren't any rooms or spaces for anything else. Then we find permit listings, at bare minimum an underground theater. We find tons of emails between Epstein, his staff, architects, and construction companies that show Epstein was seemingly obsessed with the progress of these tunnels. Seems a bit of overkill if you're just building them to run wires, especially the emails discussing wanting a particular wood flooring. Now, why wouldn't it just be concrete if you weren't spending any time down there and they were just for maintenance? There are references to a previous team, likely during the original early 2000s work, that built tunnels in a quote-unquote office under the main house. 2 months later, he was sent an email that had the heading Tunnel/Maint from Daphne Wallace, who was a financial and administrative manager and an accountant for Epstein's U.S. Virgin Islands, pretty much his whole operations down there, discussing requested floor plans of the, quote, existing tunnel building and maintenance building. Then, in November of 2017, when the new, fresh FBI investigation was really kicking off, he sent an email to Bryce Gordon, a longtime property manager for both Little St. James and the Zorro, saying that he would like to have a call with you both today. I need help thinking about how to reorganize the island. Move laundry, additional staff, tunnel, move. There were also several of the same common typos all throughout that appear in a majority of his emails, which there are many people that feel it's some sort of a code, and I can't really prove or disprove that, but the email caught my attention though, because this was around the time that he was once again feeling some pressure from the FBI, and he seems to be somewhat panicked about relocating certain things around the island. Reorganizing and moving laundry seems like a pretty mundane thing to need someone to help you think about. And a tunnel doesn't seem like something that someone could just casually move or would even attempt to do while quote-unquote reorganizing. There are many emails like this that mention the tunnel or tunnels and discuss things that seem odd or totally out of place. Then there is image EFTA 0002323 from the set of images showing what was found on the island, which appears to show a hatch. It's unclear if this is in an underground area, but that would be the safest assumption, I would say, because it clearly opens up to a short metal ladder leading down to the ocean in a space far too low for boats to use. This immediately sparked suspicion when it surfaced, pardon the pun, as being a secret hatch to allow access to a submarine. To me, it's pretty hard to tell 100%, but it looks like you could actually see the bottom below the water. It's really hard to tell in spaces like that and get a real sense of depth, but to me it kind of looks like there's some sort of a bottom not that far down. And while it's possible, for sure, the distortion of the light moving through that could give a false sense of depth there. But I would expect a lot more clearance even for some sort of submersible. Can I completely rule that out though? Not definitively. But I feel somewhat comfortable saying that it is at least kind of unlikely. What that image is actually showing though, without more angles and context, is completely impossible to say. What I will say is it's pretty damn odd, especially removed from any context like that. Engineers out there would likely dismiss it by mentioning how coastal properties sometimes use submergent shafts like this for things like drainage or seawater intake, or even as cistern access. The combination of a hidden-looking floor hatch in an interior location and seeming direct access to the ocean has led to speculation about escape hatches or clandestine arrivals, body disposal, or other evidence being carried out to sea from those, but we really can't prove any of that right now. All we can say is that it is real, it exists on the inside of one of the buildings there on the island, and that it's pretty weird. I'll let you form your own opinions about that though. Bryce Gordon, before he managed the island, he and his wife, Karen, lived on site at the Zorro Ranch. The FBI would interview Bryce at Zorro in August of 2007 during their initial investigation, but the transcript for that interview is missing, interestingly. completely from the DOJ releases. This was their one visit, it seems, and even after Epstein's arrest in 2019, when other properties were being raided, Zorro remained untouched. In fact, it wouldn't be until March of this year when New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres, having officially reopened the investigation the month before, sent investigators to execute a search warrant. They have declined to comment about what they have or haven't recovered from the residence, though. What we do know from documents already in the public record is that Zorro wasn't a random property of Epstein's. It was very clearly a major trafficking hub, with staff infrastructure, including the setup that we spoke of earlier, to transmit and receive with the highest level of security possible. It had facilities designed for housing young women. The architecture firm that originally contracted to complete the facility actually quit once they realized who it was for and what he clearly wanted. So just let that sink in for a sec. The massive home itself was, as we spoke of before, built by Bradbury Stamp Construction, a frequent government contractor who typically only works on building major public infrastructure, commercial hubs, stadiums, and most notably classified projects for federal entities, such as the Los Alamos National Lab. What they don't typically build is houses. In fact, as far as I can tell, this is the only private residence that they had ever built at that time, or that I've been able to find them building since. The only thing remotely close would be a large-scale multifamily development, such as like large apartment complexes. They have a few of those that they built, a few student dorms, and some senior living communities too. But their major focus is schools, hospitals, towers, casino, and high-security government facilities. Because of that fact, architectural journalists and industry experts have noted that hiring a massive industrial military contractor to build a private mansion is highly unusual. It's suspected that he chose them because they could also build the hangar, runway, and helipad, and, key to this chapter, extensive underground facilities. While the official blueprints of Zorro don't confirm an underground basement level, at least not the publicly available version, another set of official blueprints dated March 3rd of 1998 was later obtained and published by KOAT Target 7 News from nearby Albuquerque, reveals how the subsurface space of the mansion was officially mapped. Going solely off of those blueprints, you immediately see contradictions from the later blueprints, namely a ground-level staircase and a central elevator that both descend into a structured basement level. According to those blueprints, it included a large exercise room, a dedicated massage room, and a jacuzzi and spa room. Just a routine subterranean spa suite, nothing too crazy in the world of super wealthy. However, eyewitness accounts paint a much more sinister picture of what lurks below the Zorro. Former staffers have claimed that the subterranean network was far more extensive than even the main house itself, which serves as more of a cover for what's beneath it. They allege the existence of underground rooms that are, quote, bigger than the house, and a network of hidden connecting tunnels. Insider accounts frequently mention riding the main elevator down into the first basement level, where visitors are greeted by a bizarre 6-foot-tall nude painting of Ghislaine Maxwell wielding a golden dagger. Unsealing of the official DOJ files revealed graphic first-hand accounts of victims being used for forced births and waking up in the sublevels while undergoing medical procedures. It's believed that the girl whose journal we went over earlier in the last episode was describing the facilities that are underneath the Zorro. In 2019, prominent scientists and business associates would tell the New York Times that Epstein had repeatedly pitched his plan to turn his 33,000 square foot Zorro house into a literal quote-unquote baby farm or baby factory. We touched on these claims some earlier, but I found more extensive information to verify these claims, including his stated ambition to, quote, have up to 20 women at a time living at the remote compound, specifically to be inseminated with his sperm to, quote-unquote, seed the human race with his DNA. New Mexico officials had caught on to Epstein shortly before his arrest and were actively building a state case against him. That case would unsurprisingly be shut down by the DOJ, whose stated reason was they didn't want it to interfere with the federal charges. Imagine their surprise when the federal charges only included 2 offenses and nothing related to Zorro Ranch. Fortunately, after the release of the Epstein files revealed potential bodies buried on the property and the extensive facilities beneath it, a bipartisan group of 4 lawmakers from the New Mexico House of Representatives formed a legislative panel they are calling the New Mexico Survivors Truth Commission, which has reopened their probe into what took place at Zorro Ranch, calling on the public and survivors to come forward and share what they know. They have also recently issued over a dozen subpoenas to federal and local agencies, including the DOJ, FBI, Epstein's estate, as well as JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. Democratic Rep. Andrea Romero is the chair of the commission, and she hasn't minced words in her statement, saying, quote, Our aim is to repair the body politic that was violated in New Mexico, in this country, and around the world by one man's predation, and by silence and complicity and failures of many individuals and institutions, by having the power to stop it and did not. Before going on to add, quote, "We will not be the next ones who had the power to act and chose not to. They plan to physically survey the ranch with the latest technology, speak with survivors, and coordinate with local and federal law enforcement, as well as U.S. Congress, to ultimately release a final report on their findings. It may feel like too little too late to do any good, but judging from who they sent subpoenas and statements in interviews, it appears that they are equally interested in finding answers to who else abused victims with him, and why it seems that he was protected in doing so for so long. The new owners of the ranch is the family of Don Huffines, a Texas businessman, real estate developer, and former Republican Texas state senator. A fact that was kept secret by the fact that he purchased it through an anonymous entity called San Rafael Ranch LLC, with his wife, Mary Catherine, serving as the trustee. The price has never been disclosed publicly. New Mexico law allows for anonymous corporate ownership, so the family were able to keep their ownership completely hidden from the public until a recently unsealed county clerk record exposed their connection. Following the revelation, the Huffines would publicly announce that their explicit goal was to turn it into a, quote, Christian retreat, framing the purchase as a, quote, spiritual mission to bring light to darkness and redeem the land. They claim that they never visited the property before buying it, and have pledged full cooperation with law enforcement forensic teams searching the property. Sounds like an awful lot of money and deliberate secrecy just to open a Christian retreat and to bring light to darkness, whatever that means. So, of course, I dug into his ass too. I won't bore you with the exhaustive results of that dig, but I'll briefly summarize, and I'll be happy to elaborate on that, or any other questions that you'd like to have, or have asked me in the BTR next week or in the chat immediately following the debut of this episode. It's really nothing too salacious, but basically he has ran into several controversies throughout his career of being further right than the far right. He would receive sharp bipartisan criticism in 2018 while serving as a Texas senator for flying to Moscow alongside Rand Paul to meet with high-level Russian lawmakers, largely due to it falling in the midst of the scrutiny of Russia supposedly interfering in the U.S. election, a claim that has largely been debunked. So nothing too bad so far. Most of his political career was just normal far-right shenanigans. Where it gets interesting is when Texas oligarchy met Epstein real estate, and the subsequent sordid path of repeated cover-ups of ownership and the lengths to which he and his attorneys went to conceal ownership and lower the tax burden. Then in 2024, Huffines' attorneys were successful in pushing the Santa Fe County Assessor's Office to sign a strict, highly unusual non-disclosure agreement, in a blatant attempt to suppress public information. There are layers and layers of obfuscation involved in concealing his ownership, but I, as of yet, haven't uncovered exactly why. If any of my Texas or New Mexico listeners out there happen to know anything that I don't, please leave me a comment or shoot me an email, because I'd be very interested in finding out more about the guy. And maybe there's nothing there, but none of that really sits right with me. I'm not buying his story. If that was his plan, he could easily have done that for far less money and secrecy. That math ain't mathin', and my fledgling detective skills and intuition are screaming that there's more to this. While I've reached out to a few people, including journalists in Texas, to try and get a more complete picture, the best I can say, for now at least, is it doesn't feel right to me personally. The last of the dark rabbit holes that we were never meant to find, much less go down, involves the potential use of coded language all throughout his emails. In 2018, an email from Epstein's urologist, of all people, would be written that says, quote, "You have refills available. After you use them, wash your hands and let's go get pizza and grape soda." Another simply states, "Let's go for pizza and grape soda again." No one else can understand. The refills and hand washing seem pretty mundane, but the reference to pizza and grape soda, especially paired with "no one else can understand," is a bit more sinister feeling. Without digging into Pizzagate or the well-orchestrated scenario used to debunk it, and silent discussion of it in any kind of meaningful way, many feel that pizza is often used as a code for children, largely because of the cheese pizza becoming a stand-in for CP, even law enforcement became privy to that when it became very prevalent on 4chan among disgusting little pedo groups. So, regardless how you feel about it, there is some legitimate precedent for it being used in that way. Many have interpreted the grape soda as a sort of a code for, well, what you get if you drop the G off of the front of grape. There's no 100% way to prove any of that, with what we've been given at least, but it does seem odd even without any more damning evidence. And pizza shows up at least 800 times, or up to 900, or 2,000 if you include cheese, times in the files. Their emails requesting a, quote, quick pizza meal, scheduling of pizza parties between people without children, like a lot, something made even more unusual by comments from people like Virginia Dufresne, who has discussed Epstein's, quote, strictly disciplined approach to food, known dislike of actual pizza, and rigid control over not only his own diet, but also the diet of those around him. So mainstream's media excuse that Epstein just loved pizza, and that's all that there was to it, falls kind of flat on its face according to Dufresne and other victims. The references to Red Hook and going there for pizza gets a bit more sinister once you realize that Red Hook was the port that Epstein used to traffic victims and transport quote-unquote employees to his island. But the reason that all of these references stand out isn't because of Pizzagate, as most of all the legacy media would love to strawman it as, but because even if you strip away trying to interpret the codes through any other lens, what you're still left with is a bunch of the world's most wealthy elites talking like 10-year-olds to one another, and the creep factor is undeniable. Something just feels off. The language, it isn't natural. Amidst all the power brokering and high concept discussions and talk of wealth and investment, we have these out of place discussions that would be more at home at an elementary lunch table. Ice cream was mentioned at least 583 times, very frequently alongside references to the quote unquote the girls. Warren Eisenstein, longtime Dallas doctor and childhood chum of Epstein, would email, quote, the ice cream fairy visited today. Oh boy, can't wait. Don't worry, you'll get the report. In another email from another Epstein recruiter, and bear with me because I'll probably butcher this name, it's just kind of a thing I do, Zlata Rybarova, who was actually more than just a recruiter, but that's a whole other story, would write to Epstein discussing how, quote, there's never enough chocolate ice cream for me, and then give a little winky face, and how she was part of a, quote, amazing naked pool party the day before. Leslie Groff would write Epstein saying, quote, reminder, get photos and ice cream. A redacted sender would email him and say, quote, ice cream Oreo for Ariane, presumably de Rothschild, for Paris, question mark. Should we send with you to Palm Beach? Leslie would write someone named Sonam Dina, a Bhutanese woman who worked for Epstein, saying, quote, Jeffrey just asked you to please throw out the eggplant and ice cream, exclamation point. Just do it, thanks. And circling back to the Rothschild thing, who sends ice cream on a plane all the way over to Paris for somebody? I mean, it's not some exquisite, super distinct ice cream. It's just Oreo ice cream. And it's not what is said. It's kind of the subtext to all of it and how none of it really feels natural. And I promise if you comb through these emails, you're going to see this kind of stuff over and over again. And another email almost makes it sound like a drug reference because it's between Leslie Groff and a redacted party, which if these codes were just about food, why even bother redacting these names? That's neither here nor there. Where she says, quote, J.E. asked me about the ice cream for blank is redacted. Oreo. Probably JoJo could get some and I will take it with us on Wednesday. Why in the fuck would anyone be transporting ice cream to Paris anyway? Much less be doing so for a Rothschild who could just buy a whole ice cream company if they really wanted to. And it would be less of a equivalent amount of money for if you or I bought like one ice cream cone. She wouldn't even remotely feel it. There is way more of these, but I think you're probably starting to get the picture. Then we have arguably the most disturbing ones. The ones that seem so dark sounding, so disgusting that any normal person would refuse to believe what is implied. And as I did initially, run to latch on to any reasonable sounding excuse aside from what is seemingly being conveyed. In one email from yet another redacted sender. Mind you, these were only intended to conceal victim names. That was the only reason they were supposed to be doing all these redactions. To Jeffrey states, quote, Francis has time to come tomorrow to show me how to make it, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. He will also bring you a taste of his new jerky recipe from the restaurant, and he sends a warm hello. He is working at a restaurant called Cannibal, and cooks, wait for it, beef jerky and steak, exclamation point, exclamation point. And there are also multiple emails to and from redacted names discussing keeping beef jerky frozen or in the fridge, transporting it in a, quote, cold insulated bag, all of which struck me as odd because I had literally always thought that it was the reason for making beef jerky was to, like, preserve the meat without it needing refrigeration, right? That was why it was originally created. Imagine my shock when I fact-checked this granular detail, which I have an obsessive habit of, I'm sorry, only to find out that, at least in this timeline, you're supposed to refrigerate beef jerky after you open it now, which naturally sent me down a whole other rabbit hole and a spiral. So, you know, if you're wondering why it takes so long for these to come out sometimes, that's a big part of the answer there. So I'll spare you that one, but leave me a comment and let me know if you are from the meat preservation timeline or if you're from this new refrigerate after opening one. Inquiring minds and all that. Back to the Jerky Boys. Restaurateur Steve Hansen replies to a redacted email that had written him saying, and you hear this? Yeah, I've printed so much. I'm surrounded by files. Okay, if I move wrong, there could be an avalanche. Someone says, "Hi Steve, on Jeffrey's Island is requesting the latest beef jerky recipe as J.E. has asked her to try and make some. He says the last batch that you made tasted different, and I think he likes it as he would like her to attempt it. Would it be possible to forward us the recipe?" They would also write to him back, again before he responded, "Thank you Steve, but I have now been told it is the old way, that Francis was doing it, that he likes best, and not the latest batch. So on LSJ is going to try and do it that way. I am in Europe, but is with him on the island." This is, all these blanks are redacted names. "If you need, you can liaise with her about getting anything down." Steve would reply saying, "Recipe yes, later today, but you don't have the type of beef that Jeff likes. That was one issue of last batch. And you don't have the kind of beef that Jeff likes?" That kind of struck me as odd, considering they are literally on Jeffrey's Island. Jeffrey is there, and he's asking about a beef jerky recipe. Why would this man not have plenty of whatever quote-unquote beef it is that he actually likes? It just kind of seems a little strange to me. Then in another email from Hansen to Epstein, they talk about needing, quote, 6 to 8 ounces to send to the lab. I mean, maybe you test your beef jerky that you've been getting from the same person, which in this case would be Francis to Hansen to Epstein. But I don't. Oh, wait. Is this another one of those timeline things? If it is, don't tell me. The Francis name, who I came to find out worked as Epstein's private chef for a few months before he opened Cannibal, is Francis Darby, a one-time hotshot chef in Long Island. And it seems Jeffrey wasn't the only one getting down on this jerky. There are plenty more discussing dropping off the beef jerky, how to get it through customs, a redacted name emailing him saying, quote, "Delicious lunch, beef jerky. Steve and I are very grateful, above all, for your friendship." Again, just a reminder here, they're some of the wealthiest people in the world, the most powerful in business and politics, profusely thanking Epstein for feeding them jerky for lunch. Oh, and they talk about walking beef around. It all sounds a little strange, especially if they're shipping it to Paris, which one of the emails talks about, because I would assume possibly to Epstein's apartment there, or possibly to Miss Rothschild. I mean, I don't know. It all sounds a little strange to me, but it could easily be dismissed as just a guy with a serious jerky habit, as I have no doubt has probably already been done by multiple mainstream outlets, and maybe that's all that it is. Maybe with all of the easily proven disgusting crap this guy got up to, people are just primed and ready to believe anything about Epstein, regardless how dark or depraved it is. Or maybe he and his network of so-called elites are even darker than most of polite society could even fathom or would be ever prepared to believe. If one can imagine the despicable acts that were committed against children, is it really that far of a leap of logic to imagine them being bred in an underground baby farm in New Mexico, in the desert, or doing so by combining eggs harvested from victims, as at least 2 felt that they had happened to them there, and combined with Jeffrey or any of his friends' sperm to create babies specifically for harvesting stem cells, or sacrificed, used as little adrenochrome factories? I don't know what they're doing with them. And if you could even ponder any of that for a second, is it that hard to believe that they would just eat them too? There are plenty out there claiming far more wicked things took place. As much as I would love to, I can't prove what they did or didn't do beyond a reasonable doubt. Not this part, at least. I'll give you my personal take in next week's BTR if you're really curious, but I try to stick to provable facts, or at very least lean towards where the preponderance of evidence points. And things like this, regardless how obviously coded some of this language is, there remains that sliver of plausible deniability, the room for it all just being inside jokes, an excuse that I've actually seen, sadly, or just some people using code for more mundane things. There is no limit to the audaciousness the people involved and those covering for them in this media space possess when it comes to blatantly lying right to your faces. They do it every day. It's how the world keeps on going like everything is fine and dandy when the world's experiencing genocide, the largest and most insurmountable wealth gap in history, our ever-worsening K-shaped economy that is solely propped up by a fiat currency that is only valuable by how well the U.S. can bully the world into buying and selling oil with it. And all while it seems the scope and depth of pure evil has never been more blatantly on display. See, it's the media's job to convince you that the people on top care, and those in charge want to protect you, and how that's the reason for steadily eroding your rights. It's their job to assure you that they're the good guys, that you shouldn't worry because hope rests in getting the next person elected, that someone is coming to save you if you just go to work and pay them for the privilege of doing so, and that commerce will fix whatever's wrong with you, and things will be right in the world once you buy that new car, or jewelry, or take another jab. Because if people ever really put on the glasses, chose the red pill, or wake the hell up for real, they could no longer be apathetic and controlled, and we wouldn't stop until the current system is burnt to the ground. Because the truth is, it wasn't just Epstein or his associates, and it wasn't just all of the so-called elite. It was the system itself, and it very much still is the system. And while I can't tell you for sure that they were eating kids or running a baby farm or worshiping Satan, what I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt is that there is a level above government, any and all government, where a select few have constructed, through shared means, goals, and interests, a system of control not only for the citizens of the world, but of one another as well, and in this group of loosely connected oligarchs, which comes from the Greek word oligarchia, meaning rule by a few, just a fun fact you know now. Blackmail is currency and persuasion. Within this ecosystem, reputations aren't assets. They're more like leverage batteries, charged with scandal and then discharged whenever someone gets too close to the truth. It reminds me of the all too common defense of Trump relating to the files that presuppose that he isn't guilty, because if he was, the Democrats who were in charge of the files previously would have used them against him. No, trust isn't a handshake with these people. It's a two-way hostage situation where everyone ultimately refuses to use the blackmail, not because one or the other is innocent, but because they're all guilty, and they're all holding the same hand grenade. I don't mean every last politician is guilty of doing anything like this. I mean the people holding their strings are. And if accountability begins getting doled out anywhere along that chain, then it opens the door for it to happen all along it. They aren't bound by any vast secret society or a secret oath. They're bound by mutually assured destruction. Because in their world, loyalty isn't earned. It's purchased with the promise that your secrets will stay buried along with you if you ever forget the price. Chapter 18. The Bitter End. On December 6 of 2018, the FBI officially reopened their investigation into Jeffrey Epstein for child sex trafficking. Later on that same day, Epstein would order 6 55-gallon drums of sulfuric acid to be delivered to the island. Again, on the same day that the FBI reopened their investigation officially. Now, we do know that small amounts were being used in a water treatment plant somewhere on the island, at least supposedly, but 330 gallons of it, it was purchased through his shell company, LSJE LLC, and the supplier's name was redacted in the file, which is EFTA01223564, if you're curious, and yes, it's also in the folder. 330 gallons, for perspective, could, theoretically, in a system like the one that he had, last up to 100 years, as the amount that's actually used isn't very much, and it is highly diluted whenever it's used. So I guess it is possible that on the same day the FBI officially reopened their investigation, he just decided to switch up his usual ordering habits and buy a lifetime supply of an acid that can be used to fully dissolve a body, and a wide array of evidence, including non-precious metals like steel and iron. While it isn't the very best at destroying remains, hydrochloric acid is stronger in that regard, by a few days anyway. Don't ask me why I know that. Since he already had a purchase history, suppliers, and reasonable excuse, it would absolutely be the easiest and quickest one that he could have gotten. I managed to get around the redaction. I can't tell you how on that either, but what I can tell you is that it was sold to him by Gemini Seawater Systems out of Gainesville, Florida. The logistics of moving that amount is where it gets kind of interesting though. The large shipment of acid would have had to leave Gainesville and be taken down to the Miami port, where it would have to be handled as a hazardous material Class 8 corrosive liquid, requiring hazmat handling. Then loaded on a ship after going through customs. U.S. Virgin Islands is a separate customs zone. Then taken to Red Hook Port on St. Thomas, where every single guest or victim would go through coming to the island, and where he and several associates had suspicious tax shelter offices, quote unquote, which would require port clearance and documentation, then processed by special Caribbean cargo handlers, then loaded on a boat capable of transporting it and capable of parking at a specific dock process. Signaling established logistics networks and ongoing relationships with St. Thomas port handlers through existing St. Thomas infrastructure. The same infrastructure that had long looked the other way while young girls were frequently trafficked to the island from St. Thomas. Speaking of the Virgin Islands, the non-voting delegate from there in the U.S. House of Representatives is Stacey Plaskett. While she was taking part in a House hearing where they were questioning Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer and attorney, back in 2019, during Cohen's testimony accusing Trump of racism, fraud, and hush money payments, is when a text would arrive to Stacey's phone saying, quote, Cohen brought up Rona, keeper of the secrets, though he misspelled the name. The person that he was referring to was Rona Graff, Trump's former executive assistant. Stacey would text back, quote, Rona? Quick, I'm up next. Is that an acronym? When she would question Cohen, she would ask about Trump associates that had previously been mentioned, asking if there were other people that they should be meeting with. Cohen would mention Alan Weiselberg, CFO of the Trump Organization. Stacey would prompt him to name more, and when she didn't get the name that she wanted out of him, she finally would just blurt out Rona's name, asking who she was. At another point, Epstein would text her, quote, Are you chewing? Precisely 1 minute before a live camera feed had cut to her where she appeared to be chewing. She would respond, quote, Not anymore, before adding that she was chewing interior of my mouth, bad habit from middle school. He would also tell her, quote unquote, good work, after she followed his line of questioning. All this means he was listening or watching in real time without any broadcast lag and was actively influencing high-profile political proceedings. She wasn't the only government official from the Virgin Islands that Epstein had a relationship with or leverage over either. Governor Albert Bryant, Jr., was in direct contact with Epstein, who Epstein would even reach out to when he was facing work stop orders and potential fines for unauthorized construction on Little St. James. Governor Bryan would respond simply with, got you, and would ask the territory's Environmental Commission to halt enforcement and request that he recuse himself and approve Epstein's permit requests. This one appears to be at least partially quid pro quo, as Epstein, through his entities, donated considerably to Bryan's inaugural committee. For the record, both he and Plaskett were questioned, but ultimately nothing happened, and both still serve in their respective positions to this day. Former Governor John DeJong Jr. was also on the take, it seems. Epstein's first real connection to local government was through former First Lady Cecile DeJong, who was previously the office manager for Epstein's Southern Trust. J.P. Morgan Chase would divulge in filings that Epstein paid for Zhang's family's college tuition, and Cecile also aided Epstein by bypassing sex offender monitoring laws and travel scrutiny, when Zhang also served as chairman of the territory's Economic Development Commission. Epstein was given roughly $300 million in lucrative tax benefits, so the corruption runs deep. This chapter isn't about corruption, though. This chapter is about the end. During the course of writing this series, 2 news stories broke. One was the surfacing of a supposed suicide note allegedly discovered by Epstein's murderous former bunkmate, Tartaglione. It seemed really fishy when I heard about it. Then, I watched it get pushed into the narrative as some sort of supposed smoking gun. There's a major problem with that, though. It doesn't resemble Epstein's handwriting. I did a breakdown over my personal Facebook page, but in short, people's handwriting has a degree of variance naturally. It could be if they're writing quickly or taking their time, different emotional states, etc. But what very rarely changes are the writing idiosyncrasies, how distinct letters are written over and over, because those tend to be kind of a hardwired thing. For example, how do you write your letter T in lowercase? Does it connect to the next word? Do you make the crossing line first or second? Does it come straight across or does it bend upwards or downwards? I analyzed all the examples of Epstein's handwriting that I could possibly find to try and compare it. Epstein's lowercase t's are very distinct. It's a down mark followed by a downward dipping cross mark that usually touches the next word. In this supposed suicide note, we don't see that, not even one time. They all bend down towards the ends, likely denoting a stroke from the lower left over and back down to cross that T. That may sound minor, but in handwriting that is a fairly noteworthy deviation, especially when it occurs over and over throughout the course of a letter. Not even one looks like his normal letter T. In fact, none of the letters match his normal handwriting, and there are pauses at places that seem as if someone is doing their best to copy writing that they've seen. Why would I know any of that, you may be wondering? Well, a small little insight into me. I was a hellion as a child, for one thing, and I learned very early on how to forge my parents' handwriting and the little tricks that make it more believable. I also took a class on interpreting meaning from handwriting while working on my utterly useless bachelor's in psychology, for whatever that's worth. Does any of that make me an expert? No, but I do know a bit, and in my opinion at least, I know enough to say with a pretty high degree of certainty that he did not write that. Plus, Tartaglione would benefit from it, because even though he is cleared, many people, myself included, feel that he was at least involved in the first incident. And with everybody having a renewed interest in all the Epstein topics and digging back into the case left and right, so something like that would be a great way to permanently put future suspicion to bed. There's also other Epstein writing that popped up back when I first started writing these episodes, but I felt that it would best fit here. In February of this year, a YouTube channel run by a forensic pathologist who goes by Dr. G would drop an episode reviewing some of the writing recovered from Epstein's cell. His analysis focuses on a few of these pages, particularly one with drawings and phrases on it discussing international travel, financial logistics, and law enforcement evasion. Several words stand out, such as red notice, which is a term commonly associated with Interpol alerts for wanted fugitives. The note also references visas, banking arrangements, an airport, blackmail, things related to survival post-escape, as well as destinations like the Middle East, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, the place that he had that fake passport for under the pseudonym Robert Marius, which for the record he could really only have gotten from two places, especially considering the quality of it, either intelligence or a consulate, and the first one seems to be the most likely given everything that we know. But put a pin in that, we'll circle back later. His notes also mention the guards, which Dr. G interprets as references to monitoring or manipulating guard schedules, since it appears close to the word watch. There are also words like kidnap and MIA. Technically, MIA is an acronym meaning missing in action. In Dr. G's analysis, he characterizes the writing not as being chaotic, but, quote, methodical problem solving under pressure and structured contingency planning. So in other words, not the writings of a despondent man planning to off himself in one of the worst ways possible. This potential escape plan is, of course, in the research folder. There are a lot of words, many of them abbreviations and code words, and one large redaction block. There's also another sheet of paper that starts with what appears to be a name that's redacted, and as best as I can tell, it says something along the lines of, quote, kept me in a local, and then a question mark, not sure, shower stall for 1 hour. Noel sent me burnt food. Giant bugs crawling over my question mark hands. No fun. Which, if you look at that supposed suicide note, that is also written on there the exact same way, which leads me to believe that this is the note that was used to fabricate the quote-unquote suicide note. That stood out to me, but the rest seemed pretty mundane, some complaints. I almost moved on from it because all that's really visible when you open the file on a computer is that little bit of text there. But I happened to scroll down with my mouse, not even really meaning to, and I noticed that there was more writing. It's upside down and his usual scribble, but it's very interesting. The two items in the middle part of the page are almost fully redacted, which raise some very other interesting questions, considering it's highly unlikely that would be some random victim's name, meaning either it contains personally identifying info about third parties, which weren't supposed to be redacted in the first place, but they are, or it's something that they really don't want us to see. At the bottom of the less redacted square, you can make out the numbers 926, a word starting with a B and one starting with a P that looks like it's probably parts, but it's really hard to say. While the handwriting is barely legible, based on other notes, I could imagine that saying body parts. Beneath that are the initials BB. 926 doesn't match any US area code. If it was the start of a number, like it would be most likely a mobile phone, since that isn't really assigned a number to any particular area. But if that is a 926 prefix and you add a 7, that would take you to Moscow. I don't think that's what it is, though. It's honestly impossible to know for sure. If you invert the page and keep going, though, there is a much more compelling bit of text at the very bottom. The top word looks to be vendetta to me, but it's hard to tell again. Then the next line says what looks like 2002 to 2005 FIA or FID maybe. I lean towards FIA because when you add the years in with it, it seems like a reference to the Florida charges. The last two lines appear to say, quote, nothing or all since, and the rest just kind of trails off and it's impossible for me to definitively say what is there. The key here, potentially, and if you consider it along with the other page, is the large writing in between that. As best I can tell, it says jail out equals, or it's just 3 dashes, 10. As soon as I saw that, my jaw dropped. It could, of course, mean nothing. But if we're speculating, and that does say jail out equals 10, it's at least worth considering that the day that he supposedly died, and ostensibly was technically out of jail, was August 10th. Look, when I set out to finally cover this case, one of my goals was to stay away from the fringe elements that I felt I couldn't prove as much as I possibly could stay away from them. And just to focus on the facts, the verifiable evidence trail, and to work it how I would any other true crime case. I certainly had no intentions of making wild-sounding claims that I knew I could never prove. Yet still, throughout the course of examining all of the evidence, well, all the evidence that they have reluctantly given to us anyway, and piecing together the innumerable rabbit holes that this crazy story is riddled with, I kept finding anomalies, elements of the story that if things occurred anything remotely close to how we've been led to believe they did, simply don't add up. At this point in our journey, it should at least be crystal clear that there is far more that went on than what is ever going to be told to us, willingly at least. They wanted to bury this story. They wanted that brief little peek that we got during the Florida case to be it, and for even that to be minimized, suppressed, and quickly forgotten. And it would, or at least it would have been, just like countless others have, if not for the bravery and strength of his survivors, and the few honorable members of law enforcement, and the diligence of reporters like Julie K. Brown, who just refused to let the story go, who chose to fight to expose the truth, whatever the cost. It's largely thanks to her work and journalistic integrity that we even ever learned the details of his 2008 plea deal, that the survivors had the facts that they needed to bring about the trials, and the SDNY and FBI were ever forced to reopen the investigation into him to begin with. That wasn't supposed to happen. He was never meant to be caught again. The system had already done its job once. Despite mountains of evidence and a more than ample amount of victim witnesses, ready and willing to testify, he was still protected. But more importantly, they turned it around and used it to protect any and all co-conspirators, known or unknown, from also being exposed. The hole in their armor had been patched, the curtain closed, and once again drawn even tighter this time than before. And despite an exposure that should have ended the operation in 2008, Epstein was able to skirt most of the repercussions and quickly reintegrate right back into the same elite circles that had built and protected him for all those years. This was supposed to be it. His name faded back into obscurity for the 99% already saddled with enough worries and staying ever distracted by a news cycle that was perfectly content to vomit out narratives and capitalize off the next disaster, rather than to ever dare to give us the truth. Since it is virtually impossible to cover everything in this story, I could just leave it here and you would at least have a slightly more complete picture of what was and still is going on. This is about where I feel most people would end this series. And the thought crossed my mind as well. It would be the cleanest option, probably the safest option too, but would it be right? Would it separate this series from all of the countless other ones out there? Not really. So I have a few other very important chapters that I feel need to be included in this, and that I feel as best as possible will give this case the sort of conclusion that it truly deserves. Chapter 19, Who's Who? Starting with the surface level. Everyone that I'm about to discuss is presumed innocent and haven't been charged with any crimes. Any inference of guilt is done so as a personal opinion and not necessarily representative of any factual provable basis. Consider this for entertainment value only. Since this story first gained national attention, one cry has been the loudest and most unifying demand above all. Give us the Epstein list. Tell us who he was blackmailing. who funded him and why. While the existence of a single quote-unquote list of people's names has quite likely never really even been a reality, there are many ways to form one ourselves based on the info that is available. If I were to compile such a list based on what I know in my own personal opinion, purely for entertainment, it would look a lot like this. Many of the big names we know, like Bill Gates, Prince Andrew, love it or hate it, Trump, but there are many other major players, more than I could reasonably get into here, but these are the biggest of the lesser known ones, organized into tiers. These are people that were named by victims. 1. Glenn Dubin, billionaire hedge fund manager, longtime associate. His wife, Eva Anderson Dubin, former Miss Sweden, who dated Epstein for nearly a decade apparently, in the 80s. There are countless financial ties, and Epstein was deeply integrated into their lives. Virginia Giuffre identified him in sworn testimony as someone that she was trafficked to. He has thus far managed to avoid any meaningful fallout, and still oversees his private investment company, Dubin & Co. LP, and is co-founder of Highbridge Capital Management. Number 2. Thomas Pritzker, former Hyatt Hotels executive chairman who was pressured to resign in February this year over his deep Epstein ties. Giuffre's testimony referred to being trafficked to a large hotel chain owner, widely reported as being Pritzker. She would later expound upon that allegation, stating it took place in Mexico and was Pritzker that she was allegedly trafficked to. This would take place in civil proceedings. Pritzker, despite stepping down, denies these allegations. There are numerous emails between Epstein and Maxwell with Pritzker, and many of the ones with Ghislaine are very sexual in tone. 3. Stephen Kaufman. Giuffre also claimed that Maxwell directed her to sleep with Kaufman as part of Epstein's trafficking operation. His name appears repeatedly in victim-related litigation. His is one of the most elusive names in the entire story, and has gone almost completely unreported. Running down exactly who the hell he is was not easy, and the only person that I found of any sort of significance that has the same spelling, 2 M's, is a university fellow and former U.S. attorney. I can't claim to know if they are for sure the same person, legally, but I'm just reporting what I know. 4. George Mitchell, former U.S. Senate Majority Leader from 89 to 95. Frequent flyer on Epstein's plane, around 30 emails at least, was very close to Epstein by his own admission. Epstein funded his philanthropic endeavors and organized at least one fundraiser for him publicly. He too was named by Giuffre in court filings, mind you. These are people and names that she wouldn't have any other reason to have ever known, much less to accuse, so I tend to believe her. And it's only because she survived and was brave enough to come forward with all this that we even know about it. Number 5. Bill Richardson, former New Mexico governor and Clinton-era energy secretary. In a 2016 deposition, Giuffre would state under oath that Maxwell sent her to New Mexico to meet with him and directed her to, quote, massage him and have sex with him. We know that he flew on Epstein's plane at least 6 times. Richardson has denied any impropriety and did so until his death in 2023. Number 6. Marvin Minsky, someone that we've talked about before. An AI pioneer and co-founder of MIT's AI lab, described by his co-founder Nicholas Negroponte as being, quote, Epstein's closest friend at MIT, who even visited him in jail. Giuffre would also name him as one of the many men that she was directed to have sex with while on the island. Minsky died in 2016, but his wife denies the allegations. 7. Donald Trump. I can't leave him off this list, despite being the highest profile person mentioned in unconfirmed reports. The allegations against him are varied and numerous, from claims that he sexually abused girls as young as 12, to the horrific calendar girls auctions, to being present at child murders, and even having victims buried on a golf course. To be totally clear and fair, those are quote-unquote unconfirmed FBI tips. None that the FBI, even under Biden, felt were credible enough to press charges on. That doesn't mean that none of it happened, though. And where there is this much smoke, one would think that a little fire lurks as well. If they release this stuff, it makes you wonder what all was held back, or what all foreign intelligence may or may not have that could potentially cause Trump to do what they say, regardless how it looks. Just saying. Number 8. Bill Clinton. Needs no introduction, was also very cozy with Epstein and ran in these sus circles in close proximity to trafficking networks. Has a combined body count with his wife, a mile long, allegedly, and that's all I can really say for now, because I value my life. But if you want a little rabbit hole, look up the Clinton Foundation and their work in Haiti. Most of those names we've already discussed. And there are countless others that I could list out here that wouldn't really mean anything to you, or that we have no way of confirming their full involvement. Instead, let's pivot and look at his main co-conspirators and enablers. Number 1, Sarah Kellen. Aside from Ghislaine Maxwell, there are potentially none who were quite as pivotal to his operation as Sarah Kellen. Kellen was Epstein's primary personal scheduler, and one of 4 named co-conspirators who were granted sweeping immunity in the unprecedented 2008 non-prosecution agreement. She was 17 and pursuing a modeling career before being recruited by Maxwell and Epstein. Palm Beach PD identified Kellen as central to Epstein's operation, and Detective Rickeri even swore out a probable cause affidavit on May 1st of 2006, recommending that she be charged with, quote, principal in the first degree for unlawful sexual activity with a minor and lewd and lascivious molestation. Kellen would call the girls to schedule the quote-unquote massages, is alleged to have actively worked recruiting girls and concealing evidence. She was one of the most frequent flyers with Epstein, only beat out barely by Maxwell, appearing on over 364 documented flight logs. She was, without a doubt, one of the most involved assistants that he had. Number 2, Leslie Groff. Groff was Epstein's executive assistant for 20 years. She managed his daily schedule, coordinated travel logistics, handled financial affairs through the Black American Express card, which is technically the American Express Centurion card, a premium exclusive card that is invite only and has no preset spending limit. It has a $10,000 initiation fee and a $5,000 annual fee, and is only offered to, quote, high net worth clientele. Groff was in charge of Epstein's. She was another named co-conspirator in the 2008 plea deal, and frequently handled traveling logistics and visas for trafficking victims. 3. Adriana Ross. A Polish-born former model who was brought to the U.S. in 2002 on a business visa through Elite Models, but quickly became a, quote, household assistant to Epstein at his Palm Beach mansion. She was also named as one of his co-conspirators. She flew alongside Bill Clinton on multiple flights and took at least 165 documented flights on the Lolita Express. And in a civil deposition on March 15, 2010, for a Jane Doe versus Jeffrey Epstein case, she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination over 100 times, refusing to answer any meaningful questions regarding the inner workings of Epstein's operation. A flight manifest has her on a flight with Alan Dershowitz and Tatiana Kovalina, a fact that directly contradicts Dershowitz's claim of never being alone with Epstein and young women. She worked directly alongside the other 3 co-conspirators in facilitating Epstein's abuse and trafficking, and was an integral enabler of the operation. Not just an employee, but someone with direct knowledge of the crimes who received immunity protection in exchange for silence. 4. Nadia Marchinkova, now Marchenko. She rounds out the 4 named co-conspirators in the 2008 plea deal, and is one of the most intriguing. Epstein reportedly purchased Nadia from her Slovakian parents as a teenager at 15 and brought her to the U.S. around 99 or 2000. Victims described Nadia as being groomed by Epstein and Maxwell as a sort of sex slave, but she would go on to be a willing participant in the sexual abuse of others. In the same 2010 deposition, she invoked the Fifth Amendment at least 42 times. Around 2009, Nadia founded her company Aviloop, which we discussed previously, with financing by Epstein, presumably to justify her visa status. It would start with a bare-bones website and YouTube channel featuring young-looking girls in suggestive fake stewardess attire, promoting the website an opportunity to quote-unquote win video chats with the girls. Business filings placed the firm's official incorporation as Aviloop Inc. as an LLC using a Manchester, New Hampshire business address. She acquired her commercial pilot's license the year before. Her investor visa would expire in 2018, at which point, according to the most recent DOJ file release, she finally agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors and would continue until 2022, providing info about both Epstein and Maxwell in hopes of securing immigration assistance, which she seemingly was successful in getting. In early 2024, her normally active social media and business promotion accounts would go dark, and she wouldn't be seen publicly since. A little bit of open source intelligence reveals that she is still digitally active, just not through her previous accounts, and she is in some way associated with Zen Studio Society, a Buddhist community in New Jersey. And that wraps up the named co-conspirators. You can also add to that 3 other names that we've mentioned, those being Darren Endike, Epstein's longtime legal counsel and close operational fixer of sorts, Richard Kahn, Epstein's primary accountant and financial handler, as well as the quote-unquote Good Samaritan, who wanted to make sure that the contents of the blackmail safe were nice and secure for the FBI, so he hung on to them after having the staff smuggle them out in suitcases following the initial Manhattan raid. And Harry Beller, the financial advisor, because supposed financial geniuses definitely need financial advisors, right? Who handled the bulk of the withdrawals for paying victims and was deeply entrenched in the financial side of the trafficking operation. Allegedly. Now we need to discuss our old friend Leslie Wexner one more time. In an unsent draft email to Wexner that was released as part of the most recent DOJ dump, he began mentioning a few things of note, saying, quote, "You and I had gang stuff for over 15 years," adding, quote, "I owe a great debt to you, as frankly you owe to me," essentially hinting, it would seem, that Epstein knew where the proverbial bodies were buried. To hear Wexner, or mainstream media, tell it, Wexner was just this poor, lonely, naive billionaire who was easy prey for the predatory nature of Epstein to come swoop in and run a 20-year-long con job on him. All without poor dumb Wexner realizing what had happened. Until the legal trouble was starting. Then and only then did he somehow suddenly discover that Epstein had embezzled at least $46 million from him. But he didn't alert authorities. Yeah, seems totally legit to me. Taking what we know into account, here's a more reasonable explanation for entertainment purposes and all that. Following the Mafia-style hit on Arthur Shapiro, which occurred one day before he was set to testify before the grand jury in an IRS investigation that would have implicated Wexner and possibly others. Epstein was brought in to clean up the financial mess that Shapiro left behind and to insulate Wexner from any investigation into his finances. Wexner was the only person that held every qualifier for pulling the hit: mob connections, the money to afford such a hit, and the motive to order it. So regardless if they could ever prove Wexner was directly responsible or not, he was the single most logical person at the very top of that pyramid. Taking that assumption at face value, it likely means that when Epstein was brought in to clean up the mess, he was either made aware of it or, at very least, of the financial crimes that it was done to cover up. That is one piece of potential blackmail the relationship could have been built on, but that couldn't be the first. Or it is at least unlikely to be, since the full details would be something Wexner and co. would have had to let him in on. Circling back to the email that we just spoke of, which was actually focused around keeping that info from Wexner's wife, Abigail, who is 25 years his junior. That letter opened up discussing how Epstein, quote, "knew a lot of things about you that you don't want your wife to know." The basis of writing the letter was regarding an alleged, quote-unquote, extortion attempt by the, quote, "the same girl that has tried to extort Ehud Barak, Alan Dershowitz, and Prince Andrew," and is firmly requesting a sit-down with Wexner without his wife present to discuss it. That quote-unquote same girl, as I'm sure you have no doubt figured out, was Virginia Giuffre, and he is making it clear that he will resort to blackmail should Wexner refuse the meeting. We've already discussed the rest of the email, but the reason that I bring it back up now is because of the fact that it is so focused on info that Epstein knows and Wexner wouldn't want his wife knowledgeable of, which I have found bits of existence that seem to indicate that Epstein may have first infiltrated Wexner's circle not merely as an unscrupulous finance guy, but potentially because he was either aware of, or perhaps even in some way orchestrated, an affair involving Wexner that took place before Epstein started working for him, but after Epstein became aware of his potential as a target. At this point, to be clear, I cannot prove that assertion, only that it is something which would help explain his early position of leverage that it seems he started off with. The other angle, aside from whatever ongoing improprieties Wexner had regarding sexual exploits, is that once Epstein was brought in, he would have been made aware of Wexner's mob affiliations and alleged money laundering that he was doing on their behalf. Catherine Austin Fitts, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under George H.W. Bush and an investment banker, has spoken on record claiming that she overheard a government official state that Wexner was one of the main money launderers for organized crime. Whether that is true or not, it fits a common pattern of the mob using wealthy individuals and high-revenue businesses, i.e. why the mob was so deeply entrenched and pivotal in the whole Las Vegas casino game, to run dirty money through mixed with legitimate profits in order to quote-unquote clean it, and disguise the actual origin of said funds. So, while there is a lot about Wexner we may never know, or be able to prove at least, there is more than enough to warrant a deeper look by law enforcement. Something that I think we all know will likely never happen, though. There are countless other men, some very well known and some who have largely managed to fly below the radar completely. They're involved in one way or another with Epstein's operation. Many of them I've already named during the course of this series. As we mentioned before, For years, one of the salient points that has been discussed perhaps more than anything else is the public calling out for a release of the quote-unquote Epstein client list, and many a politician and so-called elites have felt the weight of its potential existence hanging above their heads and causing many a booty hole to pucker at its mere mention. Every time we got to a new file drop, journalists, content creators, and the public at large would rush to comb through them in search of this supposed master list containing the names of all the sickos that he trafficked to or had blackmail on. Since the first mention of its existence, it had taken on a near mythical status and become a unifying battle cry. Release the Epstein list was and still, in some ways, the dominating focus of online discourse surrounding this case. It became such a focal point that few even stopped to consider that there may not be one master list of all those involved, or that the seeming hyperfixation on this one element was quietly being used as a smokescreen to obscure the even darker and more far-reaching elements of Epstein's network. A network that spans through some of the oldest and most powerful bloodlines, modern-day kingmakers, heads of state, tech oligarchs, AI companies, multiple intelligence agencies, all throughout the ruling class and even all the way into Hollywood. They would vastly prefer you focus on the sex crimes that they know that you can't prove than to examine how his trafficking and blackmail was really only one component of his operation. That doesn't mean that the abuse and blackmail doesn't matter. It does. It just means that we shouldn't get completely hung up on only that part, when there is clearly much more here that they are still working to protect. As for the trafficking and the so-called client list, there's at least one version we do know exists, and we've already discussed it. Remember those black binders with all of the labels and the CDs/DVDs in cases labeled underage female with blank, blank, and so on that were in the safe? Aside from the contemporary reporting discussing the raid, we largely know about the safe and other items discovered on the 5th floor within that same dressing room area that the safe was found, thanks to the testimony of FBI Special Agent Kelly McGuire during the Maxwell trial. She revealed that on the 5th floor, agents found the safe. All the evidence from it, those CD binders with labels, were in a nearby closet, as well as the contact list and other, quote, name-bearing documents. While it seems that no one has ever elaborated on the meaning of that, I feel it is fairly safe to say that at least some of that, potentially what was inside of the blue binder that was full of paper that was sitting in the safe that was never clearly itemized, contained some manner of list pertaining to the contents of those black binders full of CDs with the quote-unquote homemade labels that were specifically redacted because they identified third parties, a line that directly contradicts the assertion that Epstein and Maxwell were the only guilty parties involved. Those lists combined with those binders are your Epstein list, plain and simple. If we can collectively, along with Massey, Boebert, and any other willing members of Congress, apply enough direct pressure on forcing the release of that information, then, and likely only then, will we ever have a true quote-unquote client list and a chance at real justice. Now, to wrap up our who's who of likely clients and known enablers, as appropriately as the storm begins to peak outside here, let's speed run back through some names and quickly discuss their most damning evidence that's currently known, starting with Les Wexner. Aside from everything that we have already discussed, one more element of their relationship that bears mentioning is in EFTA 016606622 and is a summary compiled by the Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force. Under a section titled Prominent Names on page 18, the only statement beside Wexner's name is a redacted victim's name and that they, quote, stated Epstein earned his money from having homosexual sex with Wexner, a fact that, if true, could also have been a leverage point for Epstein, especially early on. Next is a name that I haven't mentioned, but is featured in various photos and victim statements throughout the files, that being Harvey Weinstein. Multiple alleged victims stated abuse by Weinstein under the instruction of Epstein. I think we all know that he was a scumbag though, right? Then there's Leon Black, co-founder of a major private equity fund, Apollo Global Management. He and Epstein were deeply entwined, and he paid Epstein lots, and I mean lots of money, at least $1 billion, as we previously spoke about. Epstein was also involved in Black's personal affairs, according to emails between the two that detail Epstein helping Black to cover up an affair, as well as aiding him in locating someone to provide surveillance to try and discredit his mistress at the time when she was demanding a large payout. in exchange for her silence. A Senate Finance Committee investigation earlier this year identified what it alleged to be millions paid to women, often through Epstein as the middleman. To this day, no charges have been brought against him, and the DOJ, through Todd Blanche, has stated that it has no further plans to investigate or pursue charges against anyone who is in the Epstein files. Then there is former Barclays CEO Jess Staley, who was more than a business relationship and was who introduced Epstein to Glenn Dubin. It was Staley who kept him with JP Morgan despite numerous red flags. Emails between the pair show Epstein setting Staley up with various young women as a bit of leverage and to deepen his influence over Staley. It was him who emailed Epstein using Disney princesses as coded language to discuss his time spent with various girls that Epstein provided. Woody Allen is up next, and aside from the already disgusting fact that he married his adopted daughter from his previous marriage to Mia Farrow, Soon-Yi Privin, there is an ample amount of evidence of a tight social relationship between Woody Allen and Epstein, a relationship that would last for at least 9 years and began after Epstein's 2008 arrest. The pair shared mutual solidarity around their various similar scandals. Regular dinners with Allen and his wife, White House access brokering through Kathy Rumler, and the pair would discuss eating hearts and bones in an alleged joking manner, as one does. He also took at least 9 confirmed flights with Epstein on the Lolita Express. One of the 5 names circled by Alfredo Rodriguez as having direct knowledge or involvement, who was named by multiple unconfirmed victims and who seems to be the most protected name in all of the files, despite still being mentioned over 3,000 times, is of course, love it or hate it, former and current U.S. President Donald John Trump. I know that we covered him a little bit a minute ago, but there was more that I just kept coming across when I was trying to wrap this up. Much of it I've seen, but I feel like with everything that's there, he deserves a little bit more spotlight. While supporters love to say that nothing was ever confirmed, there is much more here than just unconfirmed rumors. Allegedly. Don't sue me or kill me, Trump. Please, I'm not that important, I promise. A plaintiff identified as Jane Doe filed a sworn declaration alleging Donald Trump sexually assaulted her at the age of 13 at 4 separate parties hosted by Epstein in the summer of 1994, stating both Trump and Epstein knew that she was only 13. The lawsuit was filed in April of 2016 in California, then refiled in June of 2016, cited as SDNY case 116CV04642, and again in September of 2016 before withdrawing on November 4th of 2016 after the plaintiff reported receiving death threats. Another accuser alleged to the FBI that around 1983, when she was approximately 13, Epstein introduced her to Trump, who, quote, subsequently forced her head down to his exposed penis. And this is also the one who allegedly bit it and he slapped her and all of that. The FBI would find the allegation credible enough to conduct 4 additional interviews with her, but only one has ever been made public, and it doesn't even address the Trump allegations. NPR would investigate and find that around 53 pages of related interview documents were missing from the public database, despite claiming in 2024, quote, I was never on Epstein's plane. Flight logs document Trump on at least 7 or 8 trips between 93 and 97, and pilot Larry Vasosky would confirm that Trump was a passenger under oath during Maxwell's December 2021 trial. There are honestly more people than I can meaningfully name here. Sadly, though, none of them matter really without the proof that the DOJ is withholding from us. I've been digging for years, and I've filed a worrying amount of FOIA requests trying to narrow down the guilty parties, and while I can and have, I'll leave it at that, name people that it seems were definitely involved in various ways, I can't give anything that the FBI and DOJ aren't already aware of and seemingly covering up. Because the truth in this is, the FBI has known about this for decades now. The DOJ was made aware of Epstein's crimes and accomplices long before 2019. The CIA certainly knew about Epstein, likely since Bear Stearns, even arguably back at Dalton from Donald Barr, and none of them acted on it. The only times Epstein was arrested or even bothered by law enforcement, it was because of the diligent work of law enforcement and survivors who pushed and forced their hand. You have to wonder why. As I briefly touched on already, not only was Epstein an intelligence asset, but buried within a 2018 FBI vault release was a form dated 9/18/2008, requesting the closing of an asset forfeiture subfile with a redacted investigation summary followed by this paragraph. Quote, on 9/18/08, case agent advised Ryder that Epstein is currently being prosecuted by the state of Florida and is complying with all conditions of his plea with the state of Florida. Epstein has also provided information to the FBI as agreed upon. Case agent advised that no federal prosecution will occur in the matter as long as Epstein continues to uphold his agreement, which goes a long way in explaining his sweetheart deal. What isn't clear is if the deal was because he was already a confidential human source, or if it was granted because they flipped him. We know through a lawsuit filed by survivor Maria Farmer that Epstein and Maxwell had come to the attention of the FBI way back in '96 regarding abuse case against Farmer, who was then a 15-year-old girl, and her older sister in New York, but chose not to act on it for over a decade, only becoming involved in '06 because Detective Precari went over Kreischer's head and called them in on the case. Which got me thinking, and this, let me preface, just a working hypothesis, if perhaps that might be how he was able to walk away scot-free from the tower's financial Ponzi scheme, while it all crashed down on Stephen Hoffenberg, who would later make the claim himself that Epstein was quote-unquote needed by intelligence services. There was another confidential FBI source in the documents who was convinced that Epstein worked for Mossad and Dershowitz was aware and involved. According to this source, Dershowitz was who told Acosta that, quote, Epstein belonged to both U.S. and Allied intel services. The source claimed to have monitored phone calls between Epstein and Dershowitz, conversations that would be followed by Mossad calling Dershowitz to debrief. They would also allege that, quote, Epstein was close to the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, and trained under him as a spy, and that they were convinced that, quote, Epstein was a co-opted Mossad agent, which lines up with everything that I've put together as well, and tried to lay out throughout this series. The document also states that Dershowitz told the source, quote, if he were young again, he would be holding a stun gun as an Israeli intelligence agent, which led the source to believe that Dershowitz was also co-opted by Mossad and subscribed to their mission. Again, these are only the words of an informant and shouldn't be taken as a fact on their own, but it does start to paint a compelling picture that lines up with a lot of other research that I've done and the info that I've seen. Chapter 20. Who's Who, Nexus, and Nodes of Power. While examining each of Epstein's significant connections on their own, that often leads to shadier, downright scandalous places. It really isn't until you zoom out a bit and start examining the overlaps, nodes, and nexuses of power that you start to grasp just how significant and far-reaching the Epstein network truly is. While it would take an entire secondary series to meaningfully cover all of these in any sort of detail, there are some very significant ones that we simply can't overlook. First, let's take a look at the primary people involved in the first significant nexus. We have Epstein, our torture-loving Sultan bin Sulayim, and a man named Andrew Farkas. Also tangentially involved in the wider elements are the Trump and Kushner families, but for the sake of this episode, we will focus mainly on our main three. The first two you should be pretty well aware of at this point, but Farkas we really haven't dug into yet. Without dragging this out too much, Andrew Farkas was born into money. He's the grandson of Alexander's department store founder George Farkas. He would get to work early on leveraging his family's money, connections, and prestige into opportunity. Even before he graduated from Harvard in '82, he was founding companies while still attending the elite Trinity School in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, along with his circle of friends who were also descended from other elite New York business families. He would resume his company building upon graduation, focusing primarily in real estate and investment banking. He, like many others, would suffer significant losses in the 1987 downturn that saw real estate markets plummet. No worries though, his family would bail him out to the tune of $5 million, which he would then use to pivot and create Insignia Financial Group in 1990, with further family banking and investments from their vast network of wealthy friends. Insignia would quickly move to gobble up U.S. Shelter, a major real estate management company, and did so less than a year later. This acquisition opened the door to taxpayer-subsidized funding through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, a service already rife for abuse. U.S. Shelter already had a long and storied history that dips into such cesspools as the nexus between BCCI, the CIA, Saudi Investment Co., the Bin Ladens, and more. Way more. Too much to bore you with here. There's also a deep and winding rabbit hole that involves the financial intertwining between the Farkas family and the Cuomos that began with Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario, former New York governor, receiving funding from Andrew Farkas' father, Robin. HUD fraud is a very long story as well and has been an issue since its founding. To even very inadequately condense how it works down is truly impossible, but a very basic example of one way is applying for funding for low-income housing improvements or construction, and then extracting that money through various means while little or no money is ever actually used to better the property in any way. Now that you at least have a basic idea of who Farkas is and how he likes to operate, let's start constructing this nexus. In 2002, Farkas would be introduced to Ben Sulayem by Saul and Howard Kersner, a pair of father and son hotel and casino billionaires from South Africa. The pair would quickly become close, and a year later, under his new company, Island Capital, he would start developing marinas in Dubai in partnership with Ben Sulayem. The Kersners, particularly Saul, have been embroiled in controversies from bribes and financial crimes to capitalizing on South Africa's dark apartheid past to further his business. Saul, like Farkas, was closely connected to Donald Trump, as was Howard, aka Butch, Saul's son. Whether or not Ben Sulayem's interest in Farkas was rooted in the potential that he could connect his Emiratis' interest to major players in elite New York real estate like Trump is a matter of speculation, but he absolutely capitalized off of it. It would be Farkas who would introduce Ben Sulayem to Trump, as well as to Epstein. Trump and Sulayem would work together on various ventures to varying degrees, and would develop close ties between the Trump family and the UAE. Jared Kushner, son-in-law to Trump and human mannequin with dead eyes, would also benefit from a long-standing relationship with Farkas. The Kushner family would lean heavily on Farkas-owned entities like C3 Capital Partners to help fund significant real estate deals, and when Jared and brother Josh launched the real estate startup Cadre in 2015, Farkas and entities that he controlled would become major investors. This is all part of a much larger network that spans back through the George W. Bush admin and his AG Alberto Gonzalez. According to journalist Nick Bryant, he says that it was actually either Gonzalez or Bush himself that was responsible for Acosta effectively getting the stand-down order related to Epstein's 2008 plea deal, and not Dershowitz. A piece that many miss is that Epstein was a member of not only the Rockefeller-created Trilateral Commission, but also the CFR, or the Council on Foreign Relations, for newer listeners who may be unaware. So when I'm saying that this network is vast and deeply entrenched in the global power structure, I'm not just talking about elected puppets or even puppeteers like the Rothschilds. I'm talking about not just the families that own and control the world, but the groups that sit above them and that collectively have more power than any individual or even any family ever could. This same network is deeply involved with multinational private equity, credit, and real estate behemoths like the Carlyle Group, and even larger and more significant entities like BlackRock and countless others. And I don't mean one or two tangentially related connections to members either. I mean direct business and personal relationships between Epstein, Farkas, and company to the CEOs and majority stakeholders. One minor example that directly relates to this particular power nexus is an Emirati multinational logistic and supply chain company called DP World that owns and operates a vast global network of marine and inland terminals, manages contract logistics, warehousing, transport, and freight forwarding, as well as industrial parks and free trade zones, effectively positioning itself as a critical node in the global supply chain. And up until February of this year, 2026, the longtime chairman and CEO of DP World was none other than Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem. He would be forced to resign after the EFTA files exposed his decades-long close friendship and business relationship with Epstein, and its global finance partners began pulling out of deals with the company and pressuring the board for his removal. Farkas also served as a significant advisor and dealmaker for DP World and its parent company/successor rebrand, Dubai World, and it would be Farkas who would steer the company towards its corporate expansion into the Caribbean, particularly in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein would use his political and legal network in the Virgin Islands to act as an intermediary and broker to clear the way for that expansion. Ben Sulayem would also consult with Epstein and use his connection for the various real estate and development projects that DP World had in the region. The paper trail linking Dubai, DP World, and the Caribbean originally came to light during the U.S. Virgin Island Attorney General's office's extensive civil racketeering lawsuit against Epstein's estate. So much connects to this nexus that there is no way to get into all of it, but this bit of background is important to get into in order to lay out the next section and how it benefited Epstein's operations, as well as why not only Epstein, but the broader intel agencies and criminal networks that he served would have had such a strong interest in developing a close relationship with DP World, particularly in helping to expand its operations into the U.S. Also, as you may recall from earlier in this series, Epstein's involvement in arms smuggling and trafficking during Iran-Contra and beyond His purchase and relocation of the CIA-linked Southern Air Transport on behalf of Wexner, and his link through all of this, as well as likely having a major role in clearing BCCI deals through Bear Stearns. That all connects him to the CIA-linked Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Well, it's perhaps worth noting that among the slew of various crimes the bank was involved in, one of its most depraved crimes, as detailed in the 1992 U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee report known as the BCCI affair, was its involvement in a sex trafficking operation where prepubescent girls were trafficked to UAE elites who were considered bank VIPs. The sex trafficking operation described in the report bears an unmistakable resemblance to the operation that Epstein and Maxwell would go on to run. Before I break down the Epstein-Suleyman-Farkas nexus in relation to Epstein's Little Pedo Island operation, I wanted to touch on something related that I've seen speculation floating around about online, but very little backed up by any legitimate evidence. That being Epstein's potential role in the 2008 financial crash. This really starts back in 2003, when Farkas assisted in the creation of a, quote, secondary mortgage system in Dubai similar to Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae here in the U.S. by helping create and launch the Emiratis National Securitization Company, or INSEC, which began as a partnership between Dubai Islamic Bank, bin Sulayem's Istithmar, or Istithmar World as it would later be called. He really likes tacking world on the end of things. A Dubai-based private equity investment firm, Pender Ltd., which I didn't find a lot about, oddly enough, at least not as a Bahamas-based entity anyway, and Farkas Island Capital. INSEC issued commercial mortgage-backed securities to, quote, create adequate liquidity in the mortgage financing for real estate sector. To break that down a bit, it's basically designed to help ensure that there is a constant, steady flow of money available for real estate loans. One way these companies operate, as you'll likely recall hearing about, as it was a main driver and catalyst of the 2008 collapse, is through something called securitization, where a company buys up thousands of mortgages from smaller lenders, bundles them into financial products called mortgage-backed securities, and sells those to global investors, effectively pulling fresh money directly from the capital markets into the housing industry, which isn't inherently bad, but when it's abused through things like toxic subprime bundling of high-risk subprime mortgages, especially when paired with deceptive, manipulated ratings indicating that they were AAA, as safe as government bonds, for example, then it opens the door for massive losses like what we saw in 2008. Back to INSEC. A considerable amount of their activities were handled through something called INSEC Home Financial Pool 1 Ltd., a special purpose vehicle registered in the preferred tax haven of the Cayman Islands, one of the Caribbean's offshore locations that's used heavily by major banks to offload toxic mortgage assets, as many did off their books in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. Former Epstein employer Bear Stearns, as well as Citigroup, would also become involved with INSEC as a placement agent, which basically just connects companies or private funds with institutional investors in order to raise capital. Epstein was still tightly linked with Bear Stearns, even in 2004, in particular with their own toxic mortgage-backed securities. This was largely due to his position as chairman of a company called Liquid Funding from 2001 until sometime in early 2007. And Bear Stearns had a 40% stake in that company. It isn't clear whether or not Liquid Funding held any of INSEC's mortgage-backed securities, but considering all of the connections involved and the fact that Epstein was widely considered a top expert in that precise type of financing INSEC and Bear Stearns, among others, were involved in, it seems like a fairly safe bet. Regardless, Epstein set atop a vehicle in Liquid Funding that helped package and warehouse mortgage risk in the same time period when those very instruments were playing a heavy-handed role in destabilizing the entire financial system. And without boring you all with the exact mechanisms, because of where and how Liquid Funding was set up, they sat in a regulatory gray zone full of loopholes, a fact that allowed them to vastly over-leverage their equity. According to reporting by Wall Street on Parade, Liquid Funding only had about $100 million in equity, but the Fitch regulatory agency allowed it to issue up to $20 billion in securities, or a ratio of 200 to 1. There's way more to it, but in short, if his products went up, then he stood to make a killing. But if they significantly dropped, he and his clients stood to lose massively. To quickly summarize the main mechanism of the '08 crisis, all of these toxic subprime mortgage products were rated highly. There were many reasons that happened, but the takeaway is that, historically speaking, mortgage-backed securities were a pretty safe bet. People are going to prioritize paying their mortgage, so anything that's backed by the commitment that those mortgages get paid was fairly reliable. That held true, for the most part, until the mid-2000s, when low intro rates enticed low-income homeowners into the housing market. Then, once those adjustable rates started going through the roof, most could no longer afford to pay those mortgages, and they defaulted, which meant that all of those securities, based on those packaged mortgages, quickly became a ticking time bomb that was set to drag all of the banks holding them down, as well as the larger banks that had backed the rapidly failing smaller investment banks that were unable to take that hit. In the end, it wasn't liquid funding that pulled Bear Stearns under, though, nor was it his supposed $57 million investment in Bear Stearns' enhanced leverage fund and his supposed filing of a redemption to pull it all out. The truth is more complex, and Epstein actually only had $20 million invested in the Bear Stearns fund, and only discussed redemption but never actually filed for it. The $57 million investor that did ultimately spook fund managers Chaffee and Matthew Tannen was listed as Concord Management, not Epstein as previously thought. While his actions certainly didn't help an already highly volatile situation, they also weren't the domino that began the progression of failures. That was more due to the collective subprime mortgage market as a whole, and the sheer number of financial entities that were left holding the bag with a market that went tits up. Now, back to Farkas and Suleyman. After Farkas launched Island Capital, he went to work building marinas, and would soon spawn a subsidiary called Island Global Yachting, or IGY, which definitely does not sound in the least bit pretentious, which was based in the Virgin Islands in 2005. A year prior, Farkas had already began a project called the Yacht Haven Grand in St. Thomas, which would formally open in '07. In January of '07, Farkas acquired another harbor there called the American Yacht Harbor, and made Epstein a 50% owner in that harbor. Due to the notoriously opaque financial record system there, it is virtually impossible to know for sure what, if anything, Epstein actually paid for that ownership. All we know comes from their emails, which is that they planned to purchase together. When Epstein went to jail, using that term as loosely as possible once again, in '08, Farkas would frequently meet with him during his supposed 12-hour workdays out of custody, a calculated move that kept his name off of visitor logs and out of the conversation for years. When Epstein created Southern Trust Co. in 2012, more on it in a second, he already had the governor, Zhang, in his pocket, and Zhang's wife working for him, as well as several other key U.S. Virgin Island officials, and was actively cultivating relationships with local customs officials. All done in order to ease his process of import-export of people or anything else. He also had made payments to Celestino White, a Virgin Islands official with a key position on the board that oversaw the airport, reducing regulatory friction even further. From all of this, you can plainly see the sway that Epstein held over that area, and how through corruption and circumventing all of the points that would otherwise be a risk to exposing his trafficking endeavors, he was able to largely insulate his activities from the prying eyes of any regulatory bodies, and the marina co-owned with Farkas became an invaluable hub for Epstein's actions on the island. Epstein remained tight with Ben Suleyman, with the pair frequently exchanging perverted emails and porn, as well as the notorious torture video. Suleyman also helped Epstein purchase Great St. James and obscured his name behind his. This is one of the many things that I spoke of in this series that reframes or totally alters parts of the official story, the one that I've previously given to you. Suleyman was 100% aware of the transaction and happy to facilitate it. All of this is just a single nexus point in this vast network with tendrils that stretch across the globe as well as through a majority of its powerful industries. Speaking of powerful industries, great segue, Josh. Thanks, Josh. The next major nexus involves the healthcare industry, more specifically the Gates-Epstein-JP Morgan pipeline, and how a network of NGOs and supposed nonprofits position certain people to benefit massively off the scamdemic, as well as any future global health crisis. This is a very deep and complex topic that involves a lot of moving pieces, but for time and my own sanity's sake, I'm going to condense and break down this as succinctly as I possibly can. The story of the COVID scamdemic began long before 2020. That was merely when all the architecture behind it became publicly visible. Let's break this down into eras. Late 90s through early 2000s, after 2008, and the period from around 2011 to 2019. Starting with the 90s, the rise of philanthropy being wrapped around this bitter pill of global health governance, and beginning of NGOs positioning themselves to hold future sway over health emergencies, first really started to coalesce. What's key here is that it wasn't set in motion by health officials trying to respond to or get ahead of any sort of emerging viral threats. This was finance entities, strategists, big pharma execs, holding meetings and working inside boardrooms at JP Morgan, coordinating through Bill Gates' endeavors, and laying groundwork not to be prepared to respond to threats, but pre-aligning authority, profit, and narrative control mechanisms years before they would come to fruition. And while all this was quietly assembling behind the scenes, it wouldn't be until 2011 that the wider mission would start to become clear. But it really wouldn't be until this year that the public would be able to fully see what had taken place, largely due to the emails in the files. Probably better to jump there for time and sanity though. On February 17th of 2011, a JP Morgan exec named Juliet Poole is working under Jess Staley, of course, would email Epstein on Staley's orders a list of questions that was, quote, from the JPM team that is putting together some ideas for Gates. The email is in the folder, under subfolder Nexus 2. The questions were an attempt to allow then convicted sex offender Epstein to help financial behemoth JP Morgan to help shape and define the structure of a Bill Gates-linked charitable fund. He would respond laying out that it would be a JPM donor advised fund, discussed how the Gates and Buffett pledge program of giving half of their billionaire's net worth away to charity, but that none of them have any real clue on how to do it. How JP Morgan would be, quote, an integral part, not advisor, operator compliance. Staley would write back simply, quote, we need to talk. In July of 2011, Epstein would send an internal email to Staley with Bill Gates' chief science and tech advisor, Boris Nikolic, being CC'd into the conversation. It starts with Gates, in all caps, and goes on to say a full presentation the first week or so of September, and contains the line, quote, a silo-based program that will get Bill more money for vaccines, a public relations strategy, and internet strategy, end quote. Then goes on to wrap up with, quote, we envisioned a multi-billion-dollar fund fairly quickly and will research the international implications for both donors and grants. Of all the various ways to promote it or describe it, its usefulness to research or public health, he went with, quote, money for vaccines. Then on August 17th, Mary Erdos, Epstein buddy and CEO of JPM Asset and Wealth Management, would email a second set of questions before an upcoming meeting for clarification. To the question that she sent asking about what the profile of potential donors would be, i.e. residency, tax status, and their level of influence, Epstein would respond with, quote, mostly initially American, however, we should be ready with an offshore arm, especially for vaccines. There were several back and forths between Erdos and Epstein, including one where Epstein wrote, quote, Bill is terribly frustrated. He would like to boost some of the things that are working without taking away from those that are not. Therefore, explaining that this would allow, quote, additional money for vaccines must be included into the presentation. A confidential 15-page briefing that was created for a panel hosted by JPM on September 23rd of 2013 lays out the fully fleshed out concept for what was now being referred to as the Global Health Investment Fund, or as they describe it, quote, the first investment fund focused on global health, drug, and vaccine development. A fund that had projected financial returns in the range of 5 to 7% while returning all investor capital, all while parading as philanthropy and enjoying the massive tax breaks that are afforded to it. This would become the financial backstop for all that would follow. In March of 2015, we truly begin to see the Pandemic Preparedness Network start to coalesce. Deputy Director of Family Interest Grants, whatever that means, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would write to Dr. Terje Rode Larson, then president of the International Peace Institute, rejecting the proposal for a gathering of experts to discuss how they would most effectively address and prevent pandemics, and declining to fund it. But would mention that many of the groups that were in their proposal were, quote, already in discussions with Gates Foundation staff about pandemic preparedness and response, and in the lead up to the World Health Assembly and G7, where it will already be a quote-unquote key topic. 2 months later, the IPI would hold their proposed convention in the form of a closed-door elite-level meeting in Geneva with the title Preparing for Pandemics, Lessons Learned for More Effective Responses, and it would include a veritable who's who of global health. A few of the people and entities included on the guest list were the Director General of the WHO, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, President of Doctors Without Borders, senior UN and global health officials, and interestingly enough, the president of the World Bank, Jim Yong Kim. Despite what the name would suggest, this wasn't a retrospective look at past mistakes or lessons learned in the field of epidemiology, but focused primarily on governance and response, how pandemics should be anticipated, and how authority could be best exercised, as well as what needed to be changed or put into place to enable the fastest centralized response possible, and ensuring that it had the transjurisdictional authority to advise that response to every corner of the world. It's important to note that this wasn't treating the matter of concern in the sense of planning for hypothetical rare events, but establishing the groundwork for a permanent set of global governance requiring set rules and alignment of authority, chains of command and responsibility, and the pre-preparedness of financial instruments to aid in their efforts. Epstein would email Boris Nikolic on May 24, 2017, simply saying, quote, "With the massive cuts in science coming, the donor-advised fund should be the counterbalance," end quote. Nikolic would write back saying, quote, "It might be a great path forward for some key areas such as energy, pandemic, etc. And those cuts could mobilize additional donors and funds, placing pandemic as a category alongside energy as an investment portfolio strategy, more so than, say, something for emergency response, meaning it would seem that 3 years before, and when no indication that a pandemic was looming, Epstein and at least one of Gates' closest advisors were viewing pandemics as a sort of persistent funding vehicle, regardless if one came to be or not." Also in that same subfolder, I've included an iMessage conversation between Epstein and an unknown associate. It's hard to get a full read on the full implications of their conversation, but I'll give you my best guess because I feel that there are several key elements that are being exposed here. Whoever the other party is, they have a direct familiarity with Nikolic, close access to Bill Gates, or at least his immediate staff, and enough confidence in that relationship to pitch public health security and vaccine framing as an asset. It reads like a career placement and fundraising memo, a strategic discussion about positioning a health policy public health figure for access to Bill Gates, Nikolic, and adjacent institutions, and it repeatedly treats health topics as routes into influence, funding, and institutional placement. There is also a socially comfortable and personally intimate quality to the other participant, most notably in the first few messages before they get down to business, so to speak. Their tone and word choice is based on my instinct, psychology/profiling background, leads me to believe that they are most likely a female with a likely long-established relationship with Epstein that frequently vacillates fluidly between personal and business. In the folder marked Nexus 2, the iMessages are labeled Full iMessage Thread Between Epstein and Unknown. The document number is EFTA 01617419, and I invite you to check it out for yourself and give me your thoughts in the comments if you're listening on Spotify. I also put together a working forensic profile if you want to use that. It's also in there as well. The point of this is that their conversation leads into a career planning session laying out all of their options, and nearly every path seems to lead through Epstein's network. They list their recent involvement in a pandemic simulation and a long list of jobs they are considering, and virtually all of them align with the industrial sector behind pandemic preparedness, such as board partner at Biomatics Capital, which was Nikolic's venture capital fund, work in Bill Gates' private office, join Merck's vaccine team, join Swiss Re, which is one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world, team developing health products, adding that she had, quote, did one for pandemics, helped develop parametric trigger. Without getting too deep, but this is important to understand. What a parametric trigger is a financial mechanism that pays out once a certain threshold has been hit. And in this particular case, it would pay out once a pandemic is declared. They also list and join the World Economic Forum as chief science advisor to Klaus Schwab. Other ones list seeking employment at the Rockefeller Foundation, the World Bank, MasterCard, Alibaba, and Goldman Sachs. A list that spans the pandemic profiteering gamut. They also mention how Gates is, quote, crazy about vaccines, and how it could be a way to gain access. Same reason that Epstein insisted that they be included in the proposal for the health fund, that being Gates' clear obsession with vaccines. There's probably a few of you out there thinking, so what, he just wants to use his wealth to save lives because vaccines save lives, right? I'm not about to get into a vaccine debate because I've seen how that ends. But I will say, yeah, sometimes, maybe. But the science, believe it or not, is far from settled, at least further than you would think. Setting that aside for a sec, let's see why he might be so obsessed and how that's been going for him. In fact, let's just hear it straight from his mouth during his TED Talk, Innovating to Zero.
So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. We could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
And you may be thinking, but that's not what he meant. That sounds like too much of a supervillain thing to say out loud and to actually mean, right? To that I say, you will know them by their fruits. In 2017, two doctors, Soren Mogensen and Peter Abbey, two longtime vocal vaccine advocates, were looking to justify the DTP vaccine despite it being discontinued in the US and Western nations since the 90s, because it was singled out in thousands of reports for causing death and brain damage. The pair looking into it were shocked to learn that to that point, neither the HHS nor the WHO had ever performed a vaccinated versus unvaccinated or double-blind placebo-controlled trial needed to determine if it even resulted in positive health outcomes at all, much less if it was actually safe. Spoiler alert, neither have the other ones on the schedule. Not against inert saline at least, and only against other versions of the same vaccine or a similarly adjuvated control. Nor have any been tested for cumulative effects or frequency safety. But that's another story, and I said I wasn't going to go there. So they set out to do a first-of-its-kind review of the evidence. Gates, along with his proxies, Gavi, G-A-V-I, and the WHO made it a priority to vaccinate African babies with the DTP vaccine. Mogensen and Abbey were shocked when they took an in-depth look at the data from the quote-unquote natural experiment in Guinea-Bissau, a place where 50% of children already die before turning 5. Half of the children given the vaccine were vaccinated at 3 months, and the rest were vaccinated at 6 months, but there was really little deviation between the two groups. What they did find, however, is that the girls who received the vaccines died at 10 times the rate of those who didn't. And while on the bright side, it did seem to mostly protect from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, they were far more likely to contract and die from other deadly diseases because it seems that the vaccines weakened their immune system overall. The doctors also found that the vaccines were actually killing more children than the diseases that they were designed to prevent. Then, in 2020, of all years, the UN was forced to admit that the Bill Gates-funded polio vaccine is actually causing polio outbreaks in, of course, Africa, in countries like Chad and Sudan. A major polio outbreak was traced back as being vaccine-derived polio virus type 2, a dangerous new strain that the same international health bodies also introduced via vaccine to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and interestingly enough, Iran. In 2019, the Ethiopian government ordered 57,000 vials of the type 2 oral polio vaccine to be destroyed following a similar outbreak there. His next big venture in vaccines was funding the COVID-19 vaccine, which was first tested on, you guessed it, the African population through Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which is basically a Bill Gates proxy. It's funded directly by the Gates Foundation. And all of that is really just scratching the surface. Back to our message thread for one last point though. After telling them to quote, put together your resume for my submission, and advising them repeatedly to work with Gates over the other choices that they had, Epstein adds the line quote, feel free to ask Bill if he would like a private meeting with Bannon, Thiel, or Barack. That was sent the day after Trump's inauguration. Epstein is trying to broker private meetings between Gates and a major power center within the new administration. Then, 2 months later, in an email involving Gates, Larry Cohen, and a redacted sender, which was forwarded to Epstein for input, we see the subject line BGC3/Bill Gates Private Safety Office, Deliverables and Scope. The email lays out deliverables across several areas including domestic health, personal health infrastructure, neurotechnology, brain science, and the line follow-up recommendations and/or technical specifications for strain pandemic simulation, which is grouped with, quote, neurotechnologies as weapons in national intelligence and defense. Excuse me? That's a very interesting group there, treating pandemic simulations as a discipline alongside health surveillance, data systems, and neurotechnologies as weapons in national intelligence and defense, no less. Bear in mind that the meaning of deliverables are the actual products expected from this project. That same year, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations would be formally launched during the WEF meeting in Davos. And it was done so in large part thanks to a $460 million initial funding from the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and the governments of Japan, Germany, and Norway. The coalition, CEPI for short, stated mission was to reduce the time that it took to develop vaccines from the standard of 10 years to less than 1 year. One of its first targets included the MERS coronavirus. And there's a lot more to the funding and structure that developed, but for the sake of time, by October 18, 2019, everything was finally in place 6 weeks before the first publicly acknowledged cases of Corona-19 and just in time for Event 201. Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with the WEF, would co-sponsor a high-level pandemic simulation exercise to game plan out a global response to a novel coronavirus. And it covered everything that we saw when it would actually start to go live just 6 weeks later, including government coordination, social media censorship strategies, public compliance, pharmaceutical supply chains, media coaching and management, and government alignment on a global scale. It isn't just that this exercise was done weeks before the exact scenario that they were game planning would actually play out in real life. It's that it aligns with and benefited from years of financial structuring, other simulation work, patent development, placing personnel on vaccine teams, and above all, financial vehicles that were specifically crafted around profiteering off of just such an event. This is without even getting into the patents that were filed, the focus on vaccine development, or the level of foresight many of those patents would go on to benefit from, related to precisely the type of novel coronavirus that appeared. This doesn't mean that it was all planned, I can't prove that, but what it does clearly show is an ongoing effort to control and capitalize on platforms that would heavily reward those in control of those platforms whenever a coronavirus pandemic did happen. And it shows that Bill Gates, who was even more invested than I could meaningfully lay out here, to be honest, was perfectly positioned well ahead of time to rake in massive profits from his investments under the guise of philanthropy. And it shows, albeit to a lesser extent, that Epstein was part of laying that groundwork out and establishing the funds that made it all possible. If you were expecting this section to just be about Gates banging some Russian hookers or trying to secretly dose his wife Melinda, now his ex-wife, with antibodies to get rid of the traces of the STDs that he gave her from banging said hookers, and God knows who and what else, I'm sorry to disappoint here. But fear not, there is more than ample coverage of all of that out there though. My goal was to give you the parts of this story that aren't sitting right there on the surface, the parts that the powers that be would prefer that you not know about or discuss. While the fact that our government is actively and undeniably covering up for pedophiles, and that so many across such a wide swath of industries and so-called quote-unquote elite circles exist is certainly bad enough, there is much more to this story. And if we know so much about this just from what the DOJ actually released, can you even imagine what all is in the files that we will probably never ever see? To wrap up the Gates and Epstein story, it wasn't just financial business between them. Scheduling records show that from at least 2010 to 2014, the pair repeatedly had private meetings, dinners alone, and with other major power players, trips on his jet, and all of which indicate a more cozy relationship than Gates has ever been willing to admit. Even as late as 2017, as the message threads indicate, Epstein had access to Gates and was still actively playing the role of intermediary in introducing, or at least offering to, him to other powerful people within Epstein's vast orbit. He was attempting to broker intros even within the first Trump administration, more than a decade after Trump claims to have cut all ties. And, for some reason, the ultra-wealthy and powerful organizations with near limitless budgets chose to work with Epstein and through him time and time again, when so many less expensive and much less controversial options existed out there in abundance. It could be because of blackmail. It could be his unusual level of access. It could be a lot of things. But none of those things are easily provable, and that's the problem. A problem that countless investigators and independent journalists have ran into in the pursuit of learning the full truth of Jeffrey Epstein. A problem that our own DOJ could likely remedy if they weren't so busy covering it all up. A problem that has led countless people into a wall where they feel compelled to either give up or base their conclusions on little more than speculation. Those are both outcomes that I've been unwilling to accept. So for the last 7 years, I've dug, compiled, FOIA'd, mapped out, double-checked, chased leads, written, rewritten, given up, started back, corkboarded, printed off, and spent hundreds if not thousands of hours trying to dissect it all. And when I thought that I had it all fully mapped out, the EFTA is passed and millions of documents, many of them new to me, dropped squarely in my lap and changed so much that it felt like starting over. Then, suddenly, a topic that had largely slipped from the front pages came roaring back with a vengeance. And as everyone scrambled to sort through the massive and largely unorganized tranches of documents, it suddenly seemed like every creator and journalist on the planet were in a race to crack the case, as if the clue to unraveling it all was buried somewhere in the DOJ releases, just waiting to be discovered and exposed. In the time since, a massive amount of content and a seemingly never-ending stream has poured out from every direction imaginable. Some of it from excellent journalists and researchers, some of it from people doing their first real deep dive into a topic, and still more from people who merely saw it as an opportunity to capitalize on the public's fervent interest in this topic, and decided to just put out any and all half-baked presumptions they could to get those sweet clicks out of it. However, regardless how well-intentioned most of it likely was, the cumulative effort was a cacophony of voices that largely just added to the confusion or distracted from the very real and very dark story at the center of it all. A story that I've come to understand about as well as one can from the limited insight that they've allowed to escape containment. But I have come to realize, more and more, is simply too voluminous, too deeply embedded, and far too deliberately concealed for any one person to tell in full, at least completely. What I've tried to do with this series is to outline as much as possible the parts of Epstein's story that we know for a fact to be true, to carefully examine and extract the evidentiary trail in a way that I feel best serves the story and the listener, while trying to omit only the parts that largely serve to just further muddy these already very nebulous waters. I hope that you feel, at least in those regards, that I've been successful. I have one last chapter to all of this, and it's arguably the most important one yet. This case has been one of the hardest to research and unquestionably the most difficult to synthesize, where I often hit walls because there is too little coverage or available information. With this one, not only is there an unfathomably vast amount of evidence and documentation, there is also a seemingly bottomless well of coverage and interpretations of it. So much so that it is virtually impossible to fully avoid while researching. I've never been one to take someone else's research or opinions at face value. I've actually tried to avoid it as much as possible altogether, because I don't want any of the conversation out there to influence my views or steer my investigation. That was no small feat with this one though. This story is ubiquitous and all-pervasive at the moment. People who typically avoid true crime or cases like this in general have felt compelled to weigh in. The life and crimes of Jeffrey Epstein has grabbed the zeitgeist in a way like I think I've never seen. Still, I've done my very best to stand out from the crowd as much as possible, without putting out wild conjecture or bending the story to fit inside of my narrative of it. So, while it may not always be as exciting as wild conspiracies or salacious details that may or may not be true, it comes from a place of honesty and a sincere hope that I can give all of you, if nothing else, the clearest and most accurate version of this story possible. And I greatly appreciate all of you for coming along for this ride. But don't take those seatbelts off just yet though, because all of it will be for naught if we don't land this plane how it deserves to be landed. Hold on tight, because it all leads to this. Oh, and I have a follow-up piece on Gates. Leave me a comment here on the socials, Facebook, TikTok, whatever, and let me know if you want me to drop that somewhere as a standalone bonus episode or something. Chapter 21. Even the end is not the end. Throughout the course of this series, I've laid out who Epstein was and how he initially rose to power, how he avoided consequence, and how vast his network really was. I've done my best to name as many names as I felt that I could, and explain how many of those names overlap and even at times create a nexus of power that wields more power than its individual parts ever could. We've broken this story down and examined it from many angles. And in the end, what the record shows is not just one man moving through elite circles or even one network, but it shows a system that was built to facilitate Epstein and men like him. Money, access, legitimacy, scientific language, political proximity, philanthropic cover, and leverage, and how they can all be pulled into a single orbit, and once they are, how they can then create something larger than the sum of its parts. This wasn't a single conspiracy with a single purpose, but a network of overlapping incentives that made the whole thing easier to sustain and protect, and harder to see clearly or easily define. The worst part isn't what this story or those files reveal about Epstein. It's what they reveal about the people and institutions around him. And while the files are a long way from answering every question, they do give us a glimpse of the shape of the machine. And the more you see, the harder it becomes to believe that this was ever about one man. The true story of it all isn't that someone like Epstein existed and did horrible things. It's that he was able to exist and function inside a world that kept finding ways to turn abuse into leverage, leverage into access, access into wealth and power, and wealth and power into a type of insulation that ensures silence. Epstein wasn't the first to figure this out, far from it. His is just one of many stories, a few that we've covered before. But his, by sheer dumb luck and the persistence of survivors, attorneys, and rare examples of journalists with actual integrity, who all refused to let go of a story that the entire system was doing its damnedest to keep buried, was actually exposed. Usually it's successful. There are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of instances that we will never know about because it was. But every once in a while there's a slip-up, a failure of the machine, a glitch in the system, and a slip of the curtain that gives us, if only for a moment, a chance to look pure evil in the eyes. The real secret, though, is that is where they want you to look. Because as long as you focus your anger and disgust on a single villain, it's far less likely that you'll cast your gaze beyond them, far enough to see the strings that held them up. I spent a great deal of time trying to dissect this case, trying to examine all of this evidence and to prove or disprove the myriad of theories and accusations regarding it, and what he and his people were truly up to. Every time I thought I had it, I would find another puzzle piece that changed the story and the picture that it creates. I couldn't help but notice the parallels between it and Mark Dutroux or Franklin. Both of these stories had a much darker component to them, one that I kept feeling here. Just beyond the headlines, buried under redactions, and only glimpsed in unconfirmed witness statements. For the life of me, though, I couldn't pin down enough solid evidence to prove, in any meaningful way at least, that it actually existed here as well. I'd pretty much let it go. I felt it was clearly there, but feelings aren't enough when the aim is to lay out and follow the solid evidence wherever it leads. Then, while I was researching the island for the last time, something happened to catch my eye, and it reminded me of an unsettling detail I had seen and then dismissed. And that detail that caught my eye was on the supposed temple building on the island. And once I saw it, many otherwise disjointed seeming elements all kind of began coming together. It was a photo of the outside of that building. In particular, the side with the large false door painted on it. A detail that I've speculated about for years now, and what its significance actually could be. It wasn't the door itself, though. It was a detail near the center, a drawbar. Drawbars, for those who are unfamiliar with archaic architecture, are a feature as old as doors themselves, nearly. And you've no doubt seen them a million times in various media, particularly in depictions of medieval castles or ancient temples. It's that heavy piece of timber that is dropped in between two upturned pieces of wood or iron, and it prevents the door from being opened, and it also allows someone to lock others out. The pertinent part wasn't that it had one painted on it. It was that it was on the outside of the door. Something that could easily be excused away or just overlooked, which I did initially. But when considering along with all of the other strange symbolism, I felt that there was a reason that he was symbolically locking something inside of this temple. And then it hit me. What if I misread this building altogether? What if I underestimated how deep all of this strange symbolism was? What was Epstein trying to say with this temple? Why does it look like it does? Are there any historical or esoteric examples that this may be emulating? So I set out to run down visual matches, which is when I stumbled on the Hammam Yabuga, add that to the list of words I probably mispronounced this show, bathhouse. It has a strikingly similar appearance with the shape, striped exterior, and even has the gold-colored dome and palm trees. This was it. This had to be the inspiration. But what the hell is it? Well, it's a bathhouse in Aleppo, Syria, that dates back to the Mamluk, another name I'm probably saying wrong, people, a name that translates to one who is owned, or slave. They were a group of non-Arab, ethnically diverse, enslaved mercenaries who were converted to Islam and trained and then freed once their training was complete to go on and become a part of the high-ranking military caste. The practice of acquiring child slaves for military training remained a key aspect of their system, and before the slaves were sent into battle, they would be washed at the Yabuga bathhouse to clean and purify them before battle. This is an interesting element, but it didn't really connect fully to what I was looking for, so I kept digging. The Epstein temple stripes are white and blue, differing slightly from those of the bathhouse. I originally didn't look any further into it than it being a visual reference to the Israeli flag. But why was their flag like that to start with? Well, it's meant to symbolize the Jewish talit, a traditional prayer shawl that has been used for thousands of years. According to the Talmud, the alternating blue and white stripes have the following meaning. The white symbolizes heaven. The blue is meant to serve as a visual ladder towards that heaven. Outside of the temple, on the ground looking from above, are what appear to represent ancient architectural aesthetics, namely sacred geometry and esoteric religious symbolism, where the squares are earthly matters and the circles represent the divine. The combination is meant to represent a way to transition between the two in the cult traditions. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Back to the door. Why only one side and why that side? After some really annoying image comparison and cross-referencing with Google Maps, I realized that that door faces north. Could AI have probably told me that? Yes, but I don't trust it, okay? So, north is an interesting choice. In religion and occult symbolism, a north-facing door signifies the dead, demonic, or the underworld, which is the reason that medieval churches would open their north-facing door during a baptism of babies from their original sin, so that any demons that might be attached to said child have a way in order to exit back to where they came from. Also, in wider Abrahamic traditions, namely Judaism and Christianity, such as what we see in the book of Ezekiel, the visions describe the north gate as representing transition and judgment, a place where God confronts the sinfulness or unfaithfulness of humanity. In Western occultism and Freemasonry, the North is universally known as a place of darkness. In a Masonic lodge, typically built to mimic the Temple of Solomon in an oblong square, there are no seats or major officers placed in the North. In occult ceremony, the direction a temple entrance faces holds great significance, and each direction is tied to an element or entity, whatever it is that you're trying to invite in or can summon. The side the door faces is seen as a beacon to the spirit world, indicating its intentions to it. Now, this is where we really go down the rabbit hole, because while the island is covered with symbolism, more on that in a minute, it isn't the only property. While thinking about symbols and symbolism, I recalled seeing photos in the files that struck me as odd, but I wasn't looking for that at the time, so I dismissed it. The photos were of Epstein with two redacted females standing in front of rocks with petroglyphs dating back to the Pueblo people of New Mexico. The images carved into it, mainly basalt, date back hundreds of years, at least, and hold significant cultural meaning to the Pueblo people. And littered throughout the files are emails instructing his staff to move petroglyph rocks to the Zorro estate. When I first saw that, I thought maybe he was just being a rich, culturally insensitive asshole who just wanted some nifty landscaping features and was just oblivious to any deeper meaning. But the more I learned, the more sinister that began to seem. It also made me wonder if there was more to Zorro than the already dark story that I had found. Sure, it provided extreme solitude. Sure, it deterred prying eyes or any hope of escape for the victims, but why that spot in the middle of New Mexico in particular? An area that he had no other ties to that I could find and didn't provide much that the island didn't. So, back to Google Maps. The first thing you notice is just how desolate that place really is. But that's nothing that I didn't already know. What about cardinal directions? To the west of the ranch is the Conocito Indian Reservation and the historical home of the Pueblo people. Roughly the same distance east, I saw nothing, and when I was preparing to give up searching, I saw a strange little building with no listing on Google Maps, inside of a tiny little nothing town called Trementina, New Mexico. After more searching, I found out about Trementina Base, which is a whole big-ass rabbit hole, but in short, it is a major quote-unquote base of Scientology that supposedly contains underground vaults where over 135 tons of L. Ron Hubbard's texts are etched into steel plates and sealed inside titanium capsules. At first, I thought, well, that's weird as hell, but probably unrelated. But then it hit me his actual story. See, he was initiated into Aleister Crowley's second satanic-adjacent occult magic club, the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, which he technically just kind of took over and reshaped around his Thelema beliefs, which is a whole other rabbit hole. But Hubbard was initiated into that order by none other than Jack Parsons, who you may know, recognize the name at least, as the rocket scientist who founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, which would go on to become a key component of NASA, which is a whole other big-ass rabbit hole, trust me. Crowley's big shtick was sex magic, whereby one can use moments of extreme emotional states like sex to manifest things by implanting it into their subconscious. Look it up, there's really way too much about that to cover here, and I'm definitely the wrong guy. Point being, using Crowley's teachings, Parson and Hubbard would conduct a series of quote-unquote sex magic rituals that they called Babylon working. This occurred between January and March of 1946, which was to summon a Thelemic goddess into our realm, which they claim they were successful in doing. Shortly after, Hubbard runs off to Florida with Parsons' girlfriend, Sarah Northrup, and Parsons' life savings, which is kind of like L. Ron saying, yeah, I summoned my goddess. See you later, man. Which, sorry, is kind of fucking hilarious. Moral of the story, Hubbard's little metal library in heart of Scientology sits roughly an equal distance from Zorro as the Pueblo land where Epstein was jacking the petroglyphs from. Does that mean anything? Maybe. It's at least a fun fact that you know now, right? Before we go back to the island, though, there's one more odd souvenir that Epstein kept at the Zorro, or at least was rumored to, and this item takes us back to 1760 in the construction of the San Jose Gracia Mission Church in the tiny little village of Las Trampas in New Mexico. Shortly after construction was completed, the church began casting of the church bells. While primarily cast from standard bronze alloys, a local tradition dictates that during the casting process, devout parishioners would donate personal belongings like family jewelry, silver coins, and gold, and put them all into the melting pot to be cast into the bell. One of the bells, the Maria de la Gracia, or the Happy Bell, is historically believed to have gained its uniquely sweet, resonant tone due to the inclusion of that silver, and the same random mix of precious metals also contributed to the Maria del Refugio, gaining its distinct, deep, somber tone. That bell would go on to be known as the Death Bell, and that bell was slightly smaller and was reserved for use during funeral mass to signify the passing of a parishioner. During the 1930s, the church would undergo a series of renovations. It's a little bit foggy about how things actually went down, but during the work being done on the tower, which was housing the bell, it would be taken down, and while the exact year has been kind of lost to history, it would go missing and disappear for roughly 80 years. That is, until August of 2020, when tucked inside of an internal FBI intel report marked unclassified/for official use only that was produced by the Albuquerque FBI, and which details a tip that the office assessed as being medium confidence. The tipster, a Las Trampas native named Timothy Lopez, informed the FBI that while reading about the ranch in a local real estate magazine, he recalled seeing what appears to be the missing bell in one of the photos that showed a room inside of the Zorro Ranch. The extent of looking into that tip by the agency was taking drone images from above and thumbing through various online photos of a wedding that was conducted there for Epstein's pilot, Larry Wasowski's daughter, that were posted to Facebook. Despite this tip, the email regarding the claim of 2 girls buried on site, and the police and FBI searching his other main properties in New York and Little St. James, there would be no search of the Zorro land, and local police would have their investigation shut down. As wild as this claim is, it's far from the only sacred object that Epstein seemed intent on hunting down. Recently unsealed court documents detail that in 2007, Epstein had 3 large pieces of the Kiswa sent to his Florida residence before sending them on to the island. For those unaware, as I was when I stumbled onto this, the Kiswa is the sacred black and gold embroidered cloth that is used to cover the Kaaba in Mecca, the most holy site in the Islamic religion, believed to be where Adam built the first place of worship. Yes, that Adam. He would somehow convince someone within the UAE, the name on the invoice who shipped them was a businesswoman named Aziza Al-Ahmadi, to send him pieces of the sacred cloth that was described as being, quote, touched by 10 million Muslims of different denominations in prayer. They would slip the large pieces through customs disguised as being commercial artwork in wooden picture frames. The 3 pieces actually consisted of 1 unused black fragment that was produced from the same place that makes the Kiswa, which was used to disguise the other 2 pieces, which were 1 section taken from the giant cloth covering of the Kaaba, and 1 piece taken from a section used inside the Kaaba in a highly restricted and extremely sacred space. The rest of the description states the significance aside from the 10 million Muslims part by saying, quote, they walked around the Kaaba 7 rounds, then everyone tries as much as they can to touch it, and they kept their prayers, wishes, tears, and hopes in this piece, hoping after that all their prayers would be accepted, end quote. She was describing the ritual of tawaf, and in other emails about the cloth, it also emphasizes that the fabric essentially carries the physical and spiritual energy, including the metaphorical fingerprints, tears, and unanswered prayers of the Islamic world. Now, why would a Jew be seeking such a revered artifact to the Muslim faith? you may be wondering. Well, not even a practicing Jew, Epstein. It would seem that it is much less about the religious aspect and much more about collecting artifacts that were charged with some sort of a spiritual energy. But how do we know that? And how do we know that the Zorro location had any special ties to anywhere else? Oh, don't you worry, curious minds. I'm about to lay it all out for you. When I first started going back through the files, I became interested in the books that Epstein was ordering. At the time, his books on sex slavery were what really grabbed my attention because they seemed to be the most pertinent to what he was doing. When I was trying to piece together this part of the story, though, I remembered two others that had caught my eye. Shortly before ordering the Kiswa pieces, Epstein had purchased two books, both in the same month. One called Secrets of Western Tantra, The Sexuality of the Middle Path by Christopher S. Hyatt, Ph.D., and among others tangentially related, A Modern Sex Magic, Secrets of Erotic Spirituality by Donald Michael Craig. While they didn't mean much to me at the time, the whole seemingly tangential sex magic connection that we spoke of earlier made me want to dig a little deeper. Turns out that Hyatt was a 9th degree, which was the same as Jack Parsons, initiate of Crowley's OTO sex magic group. And in his book, it describes how to apply those principles to create specific outcomes or manifest what you want, including summoning spirits, as in the Babylon working rituals. Craig's book is essentially written as a bridge between occult ritual practice and more modern sex magic. Taken together, they lay out the practices that it seems Epstein was using and why these spiritually charged objects were so important to him. Craig's book also traces the history of Kabbalistic sex magic dating back to Solomon's Temple, which, if you're unaware, was basically the origin point of not only Freemasonry but Kabbalistic magic practice. And Solomon was said to have harnessed and controlled demons that were used, among other things, to construct his temple. Just look up the Seals of Solomon if you want to know more about that. Now, back to the island. Outside of his quote-unquote temple are two statues. There are others, but two main ones that I want to focus on. Those are of Greek mythological figures, Aphros and Bythos, which were two of the main figures associated with Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, beauty, and namely sexual desire and pleasure, or erotic love. And if you know me, then you no doubt know that Greek and Roman gods and goddesses has always been a topic that's been very fascinating to me. But I won't bore you with their lore, but that's the main takeaway. Back to Solomon's Temple for a sec. One major defining feature of it that we see pop up over and over through occult and esoteric practices, as well as Freemasonry, as I've mentioned, are the twin pillars, Boaz and Yakin, as described in the biblical First Book of Kings as standing on the porch outside the temple. And Solomon's Temple, and traditionally, they were twins, standing for in strength and he will establish. The twist comes in during Kabbalism and other occult practices, the Tarot and Freemasonry, where they symbolize duality, the material and physical worlds, light and dark, good and evil, etc. Inside of Epstein's temple, we find the same two columns, one straight and one twisted. Also inside the temple, we find a large mural covering the ceiling that has a backdrop that's consisting of a clouded sky with elaborate paintings consisting of the zodiac alongside a mix of animal symbols, mythical creatures, and constellations. There has been no shortage of wild speculative interpretations of its meaning, but if we examine it through the same occult and esoteric lens as the rest seems to be trying to evoke, we come away with a few distinct meanings. A painted sky inside of a closed structure plays directly into the occult philosophy. In particular, that was a central part of Crowley's teachings, both at the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as the OTO, and was described in detail within his book called Book of the Law as signifying, quote, as above, so below, a microcosm of the universe brought down into a localized private space. Crowley considered the Hermetic maxim of as above, so below to be a fundamental law of the universe. To Crowley, the mechanism that makes magic work at all is laid out in that statement, whereas the human mind and the universe are intrinsically linked parts of the same fabric, and a magician can alter their internal consciousness, the microcosm, to cause a corresponding ripple effect change in the external world, or the macrocosm. The zodiac symbols and the mythical creatures are reminiscent of ceilings that are found in Masonic lodges. In esoteric architecture, this serves to remind initiates of the grand scale of the cosmos during ritual practices. As above, so below wasn't invented by Crowley, though. It goes all the way back to at least 2,000 years to the text known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, aka Thoth or Thoth, however you want to say it. which is itself a really wild rabbit hole to check out sometime if you haven't already. There's even more symbolism to the island, its structure, and its layout, but it requires more speculation in many cases, and I think you kind of get the drift at this point. It's generally been claimed or dismissed that the so-called temple was unfinished at the time of Epstein's arrest because photos and drone footage of the inside show it largely in a state of disarray. In my opinion, I feel that it's definitely possible that it was actually being covered up and most of the more telling elements of the inside were already removed by that point. I say that for one reason, because the inside appears to be partially in the process of having everything renovated or removed from it, and we only have the large empty bookshelves and columns, construction-grade scaffolding, an easel, and 2 stacks of twin mattresses wrapped in yellowed plastic laying near the window. Considering there was a set of descending stairs beyond the large bookshelf with the columns, I don't even want to know what they were used or planned to be used for. I will say twin mattresses are too small for most adults to comfortably sleep on, and are far more often found on children's beds. So, if they were just intended for some really weird guest accommodations, they go against what he would use in any other such a case, and those quote-unquote guests would likely have had to have been children. Enough said. Considering the structure was built around 2012, the excuse that it was just unfinished doesn't seem likely to me. His emails show that Epstein actively pushed for construction to be completed as quickly as possible, and that he checked up on its progress regularly. Which really only leaves us with the possibility that what remains inside is only what survived efforts to cover up what was going on, either shortly before his arrest or right after. Now, at this point, you may be wondering what the point of me telling you about some of those heavily charged objects that he was collecting was. To lay that out requires discussing the law of contagion, which is a major foundational principle of magic practices around the world, and other occult ritual practices that state essentially once an object comes in contact with something, someone, or intentions, it remains in a sort of contact at a distance even. Or to explain more succinctly, energy and intention can be placed onto and into an object, which it then stores and acts like a sort of magic battery. This is the same logic that lies behind religious relics and talismans. The object takes on the power and then retains it, and it can be used later to amplify spells, intentions, and manifestations, and even to harm or heal like what you see with voodoo dolls and such. Each of the items he began collecting after reading the 2 books were charged with energy, at least according to this belief. Aside from the death bell and pieces of the kiswa, he also went through the trouble of importing authentic antique mosaic tiles directly from a historic mosque in Uzbekistan to use on the property and in his temple, and as more and more digging is done through the files, and potentially at his properties, there's a pretty good chance that we will uncover even more. These items weren't part of some eccentric theatrics, as some mainstream outlets seem intent on dismissing them as. These were all very specific items that he actively sought out, and it isn't just coincidental that all of them would carry a high level of energy that Epstein would have been well aware of. It seems more logical, as crazy as it may sound to the uninitiated, that he was very deliberately piecing together a collection of some of the most spiritually charged relics possible, and potentially planned to gather them inside of a space that he had built with specific intentions to contain them and to further charge the space. Based on the patterns that I've mentioned and the reading material that seemingly motivated it all, is it then possible that part of his darker scheme was to gather together powerful people and objects in a space custom designed to amplify that power for sex magic rituals in order to manifest outcomes or even to summon an entity or entities into our physical realm? Now, I realize how crazy that sounds, as crazy as there being some class of satanic elites, but the signs of both pop up over and have for much of recorded history, especially regarding the latter point. To those of us normies who don't believe in any of that, it sounds preposterous, even silly, like it couldn't possibly be real. Yet, the signs all seem to point that way. Even before Epstein, there was a sex magic / satanic element to the Mark Dutroux case, Anne Franklin, and countless others. In fact, it seems that virtually any time we uncover a child sex ring, ritual abuse is right there with it, just below the surface. So consider this. Maybe it's supposed to sound ridiculous. Maybe the whole reason that it's been so trivialized in modern media is to make any suggestion of its existence, regardless of the evidence, seem too far-fetched to be real. It not only helps to cover the dark reality of it, but it makes it that much easier for them to reasonably quote-unquote debunk the entire story by focusing on what seems too outlandish to even be real. We have undeniable evidence that Epstein was gathering blackmail on powerful individuals, yet virtually zero evidence of it ever being deployed, and really no apparent evidence that any of his work as an FBI confidential human source was ever used to actually take down any of the powerful people or networks that he could have. From all that I've found, I have little to no doubt that he was working with or for at least Israeli intelligence and likely the CIA. We have documented proof that he was serving as a CHS for the FBI, and it's clear that those things helped to protect him from legal consequences and deeper investigations on, at bare minimum, one occasion when his operation was forcibly exposed and should, by all logic, have been taken down. But what if that was all that it was really for? Keep him out of prison and the spotlight of the judicial system and the public, and possibly to make a little cash on the side. What if all that evidence was more about mutually assured destruction among the elite? Think rumors and witness statements of rituals like Eyes Wide Shut being real in Hollywood and elsewhere, used to ensure group cohesion, lessen the risk of anyone exposing the dark truth because it would mean outing themselves as well. It builds a sort of unbreakable manufactured trust that ensures continued networking, keeps doors open, so to speak, and helps keep everyone on the same page, sending the same messages and furthering the same agendas. It creates a secret layer of power and influence that supersedes and exists above any government or leader. It makes sure that any investigation into itself or the elites within it is shut down and covered up and buried under layers of obfuscation, concealed behind preposterous-sounding elements and satanic ritual abuse or sacrifice or adrenochrome. Maybe the reason that exposing Epstein or Maxwell and the pedophilic element is so tolerated, even pushed by the media, is precisely what I said earlier, because so long as the public stays angry and disgusted about that, and they have what feels like a major revelation to chew on and hyper-focus about, it's because it makes the darker elements like all of this, or even cannibalism, which we also see briefly pop up in the other stories before being mocked and forgotten, that much less likely to be fully investigated or become the big focus. If there was one big salient takeaway from all of my research into this, it isn't that Epstein or Maxwell or any of these so-called elite members of the Epstein class being deviants is the real story here. It's that it was all knowingly allowed to happen for decades, just in this one case, by an entire system that created, enabled, protected, and possibly even disposed of him once he became a liability too great to cover up any longer. It's that this system wasn't built by Epstein. It was there long before him, and it is still there now, and until enough people wake up and start asking the right questions and looking in the right places, it will continue to exist indefinitely. It will continue to allow the most vulnerable to be abused by the most powerful, to be used as currency, to serve as social leverage or ensure cohesion, to ensure that no one who knows the full story can use it against the powerful or against the system itself. That, ultimately, is why, despite the fact of proof, the powerful co-conspirators or clients that exist all through those files and are without a doubt further exposed in the files that we will never see, the vast majority were allowed to just walk away untouched. To this day, they still have their vast wealth, their positions, their lives, all intact, and with no further investigations planned by Todd Blanche, whose salary we pay through our Department of Justice, which we fund, and the blatant reality of our two-tiered justice system continues on as it always has. See, what this case ultimately reveals isn't just the depths of one man or a few people's depravity, but the extraordinary lengths taken, as always, to shield the people and institutions around him from all consequence. The more you follow these sort of cases, the clearer it becomes that it was never about the people who get exposed, or even the extent of the crimes that they commit that we are allowed to later hear about once their usefulness has waned. It's always about the systems built to absorb the damage, contain the scandals, and protect the well-connected bigger fish, all while the vulnerable pay the heaviest price. And that is what makes the final truth so difficult to ignore. While some people are investigated, exposed, destroyed, or even killed to keep them silent, others simply move on to create or be absorbed into new networks, and the cycle keeps repeating. Because the people and institutions with the power to stop it keep choosing protection over truth, convenience over accountability, and above all, silence over justice. And it will continue until enough of us make our voices heard, and until we ensure that that bargain is too costly to accept any longer. If we've learned anything from all of this being exposed, it's that the truth is not enough on its own. It has to be demanded, defended, and forced fully into the light. And it takes all of us to do that, because the system is designed to prevent itself from ever doing that on its own. Case closed. Epilogue. This series is dedicated to the memory of Virginia Giuffre, Carolyn Adriano, and Lee Skye Patrick, as well as to all of the survivors whose lives were forever altered by Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and the powerful men who enabled, benefited, and participated in that abuse. Their suffering was real, their losses are permanent, and their stories deserve to be remembered with the dignity that should have been afforded to them all along. But the record alone cannot tell the full story of what was taken from all of the survivors. I can try to show how power moved through the system, how the harm was minimized, and how accountability was delayed or denied altogether. But what this series or the official record can never fully capture is the private cost carried by the people who lived through it. That is where this part of the story has to begin. Not with Epstein or the men who built the network around him, and not with the institutions that enabled, protected, and failed to stop him, but with the people who endured the damage long after the court system and the headlines had moved on. Because for far too long, the public conversation around the Epstein case has centered on the two people at the heart of it, the powerful men who participated, the institutions with the influence, and the paper trail of access that tied them all together. But that framing can only go so far. The real weight of this story lives in the people whose lives were disrupted, damaged, and in several cases, ended by what they thought that they had survived. Their pain was not incidental to the operation. It was the cost of it, and that cost did not stop when the abuse did. For many, the aftermath followed them into every corner of life, into health, relationships, trust, work, lasting battles with addiction to the same drugs that once were used to try and block out the abuse, and of course, the long struggle just to be believed. And that is why the story cannot be told honestly if it just treats the survivors as background characters in someone else's rise and fall. They are not some footnote to the scandal. They are the reason that the scandal matters at all. What they endured should never have happened, and what they've carried since then should never have been theirs to carry alone. This isn't the tale of mere victims, though. It's about the survivors. Those who, despite everything that the system put in their path, many of them continued to speak, to demand accountability, to testify, to name what happened, and to insist that the truth not be buried beneath power, denial, or distance. That matters, because stories like these are too often told as if the abuse were the beginning of the story, and the aftermath were a footnote. It isn't a footnote. It's the part that follows survivors into every single year after. A story like this should never ask the audience to consume suffering for its own sake. It should illustrate to them what abuse does, what it looks like, and the lasting struggles that many faced to rebuild a life that was damaged by someone else's poor choices. That's why the survivors' voices matter so much here. Not because they make the story more dramatic or more salacious, but because they make it more true, and they punctuate the very real human cost at the center of it. If this story has brought up anything painful to you, or if you are a survivor of sexual abuse, trafficking, coercion, or exploitation, please know that help is available. You do not need to carry this alone, and you do not have to tell your whole story before you're ready. If you need support in the U.S., you can contact RAINN, that's RAINN, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, by calling 1-800-656-HOPE. Again, that's 1-800-656-4673, or HOPE. If you hate talking on the phone as much as I do, you can also chat with someone online by visiting RAINN.org. For victims of trafficking, there's a National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888, or text 233-733, which spells Be Free, on a number pad if that's easier for you to remember. I also want to give you the info for the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which you can just call or text 988 for immediate emotional support. No police, no judgment. Just someone to be there for you if you find yourself in crisis thinking about self-harm. For my international listeners, there's help available for you as well. Many countries have their own services, but you can also reach out to the Polaris Global Modern Slavery Directory, who can help connect you with people in many countries with trafficking-related services, shelter, psychological support, as well as legal support if you need it. In the UK or Wales, Victim Support offers emotional and practical help for people affected by crime and traumatic events. So please know that support exists and you do not need to face this alone. If you are currently or find yourself in one of these situations, please contact your local emergency number as soon as you feel that you can safely do so. There are a lot of situations where acting quickly could mean the difference in saving yours or someone else's life, and whether or not the perpetrators can be held accountable and prevented from continuing their abuse in the future. Help, advocacy, and crisis support are available, and reaching out can be the first step towards safety, healing, or just being heard. Recognizing the signs and acting swiftly is the only way that we can meaningfully prevent another story like this one from ever happening again. I just want to pop in here real quick at the end to thank each and every one of you for listening to this, for coming back for each one of the episodes, and for your patience with me while I tried to get all of this out. It was a lot. This whole series was a massive undertaking, and there was a lot of very painful things that are just kind of inherent parts of talking about these sort of stories. So again, if any of this brought up any kind of distress in you, then I sincerely apologize. And I do hope that if there's anything that you need, you feel comfortable enough reaching out and finding it. Because I promise that you're not alone out there, even though it does feel like it at times, I know. And to everybody else, I hope that you come away from this with at least a little deeper and more clear picture of what was going on with Epstein and his network. It's not a story that you can just summarize quickly or easily, and it's not something that you'll fully understand just by digging through a bunch of random documents. It's something that we see repeat time and time again, and it was the whole point of the final episode that I did of the Franklin scandal. Because these are patterns, and they do pop up over and over in vast different networks all over. And standing up to those responsible for these things is paramount to ever fixing it and preventing more victims. So if you or anyone that you know is a victim of any of this, has survived any of this, has any information on the people that are responsible for these things, then I strongly encourage you to, when you feel that you can do so, contact someone as soon as possible. Being proactive, identifying these things, recognizing the signs of them, and going to the proper authority in a timely manner is crucial to being able to prevent these things from continuing to happen again and again. Thank you guys once more. I hate to leave this on such a somber note, but there is a very heavy toll to all of this. It's not one of those fun stories. It certainly wasn't enjoyable to go through or present, but I think that it's something that's crucial, and I really do hope that you gain something from it. So thanks again for checking it out, and I will talk to all of you again very soon. I'll be back in 1 week with you for a BTR. If you've got any questions about this series or anything that you think I missed or you want to know more about, just shoot me an email, clandestinradiopodcast@gmail.com or at proton.me if you want something a little more secure. And I would love to hear from you, and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions you've got. If you're on Spotify, leave a comment. I read every one of them. I respond to everyone that I can. Pop on over to the Discord. We've got a great little community that's starting to build back up over there. And I will be there at the end of this episode, once it debuts, to answer any kind of questions that anybody's got. So that's kind of a perk of actually listening to the episodes when they drop, because you can be part of the conversation at a little bit more depth. Or you can just pop over there pretty much any time and ask a question. Either myself or one of the moderators will be there to answer it for you and to discuss things with you. So interact, it means a lot. That's the whole point of this entire podcast, was to kind of bring together a community of like minds and educate, share with each other, support one another, and to build, because there's too many things in this world that are more than happy to tear you down, and we're certainly not going to be saved by our government. So it's up to us to build those networks and to take care of each other. And if nothing else from this entire podcast, I hope that you take that away from it. Thanks again. I'll talk to you guys again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.